Okay, right. So this is something that I want to tell you guys, right? So programming is not very much difficult to learn. But why most of the times, right, people feel it difficult is because, um, right, so the person who teaches coding most often, right, confuse the learners. Okay, that's when people feel like, maybe this is not for me. So let's not do it anymore, right? So people will come to that kind of conclusion because of that chaos or that particular confusion. But if you are learning from someone, right, who is teaching it systematically or methodologically, right, so and helping you understand each and everything, then it is very, very easy to learn and it is very, very easy to understand as well. Okay, but here also, right, if you are not practicing, okay, so if you are feeling like, so I'm able to understand whatever that was taught in today's class, right, so I don't need to, I mean, like, so I don't need to worry much about it, then you'll definitely so face the trouble. Why? Because, right, so in order to remember that, right, you have to practice. Okay, so if you are practicing well, right, so then there will be so more absorption, right? So when you have more absorption rate, right, so you'll remember it for a long time. Okay, so that is what I want to say. Okay, so once we are done with our classes, so please make sure that you're going through that video once again, right, if there is any possibility, right? So and so whether you are going through that video again or not, but make sure that you are completing the hands-on exercises that are given for you on daily basis. Okay, so and the next thing is, so I believe most of you people already know that we are not providing any notes. There is a reason behind that. Okay, so I mean, like, so when we were able to build this much platform, right? So when we are able to give you these many hands-on exercises, creating notes is also not a big, what task for us. Okay, so we can definitely do that. But the reason why we are not doing it is because, right? So we want you to write your own notes. We already have Trailhead, right? So if you want theory, so you can go to Trailhead and go through whatever concept that you want to go through on Trailhead itself. So that much use content is already available. Okay, so but if you want to remember things, right, so what I would recommend all of you guys is, please make sure that you are writing your notes on your own. Okay, once you are done with the class, right, so whatever things that were discussed, just simply write it as pointers, right, in any book or whatever it could be, in whichever way you are understanding them. Okay, so that it will become easy for you to refer to those concepts so whenever needed. Okay, so please make sure that you are doing it. Okay, so see, what will happen is that, right, if you are not writing notes and if you want to go through a particular concept that was taught on day one of the development, right, so then what will happen, right, so you have to come back to that day one and you have to watch the whole video. All right, so you may not know where exactly that particular thing has been discussed. If you are get if you got it, if you get a doubt, and so the solution for the doubt is there in the first day one's video, then what will happen, right? So you have to go through that whole video and it will again, right, so kill lot of time for you. Okay, so instead of wasting your time at the later stages, right, so better start writing notes from the beginning so that it will be easy for you to refer through those things, right? So and so even if you are writing the notes, what will happen is that, right, so it will register once again, right? So you are listening to the class, right? So you are attending the class and you are absorbing something through the class, and after that you are writing the notes. While writing the notes, there are chances that you'll definitely watch the video, right? So since again you are watching the video, again you are absorbing that content, since again you are putting that on the paper, or so on your notepad or word or whatever it could be, right? So that means, right, so again it is registering into your brain, right? So there also you are absorbing, and while doing hands-on exercises also you'll absorb things, right? So if this is happening for over the period of time, then what will happen, right? So no one can beat you in this particular space. Okay, so you should so you should get into a stage where even if someone asks you something after 5 years, you should be able to tell them, right? Whatever you have learned on a given day. Okay, so how that will happen? So that will happen through consistency, right? So you have to be consistent in attending the classes, right? So please make sure that you're doing it, right? You have to be consistent in writing your own notes, right? So please make sure that you're doing it, and be consistent in completing the hands-on exercises or the projects, right? And the projects, whatever that are given, to you in order to, so complete this particular development program. Okay. Is it clear?
Yes, sir.
Okay, good. So will you guys do this? ఎవరు చేయడారా?
చేస్తాను.
అరే ఎవరు మాట్లాడరు ఏంటి? హర్షిని, పద్మిని, శ్రీలేఖ, బున్ని. I heard nothing from your end. Are you guys active? తెలుగులో చెప్పమంటారా లేదా ఇంగ్లీష్లో చెప్పమంటారా? చెప్పండి. ఇంగ్లీష్లో నేను కంటిన్యూ చేయనా, లేకపోతే do you want me to explain it in Telugu, right? Or do you want me to discuss things in Telugu?
తెలుగు ఇంగ్లీష్ కలిపి చెప్పిన పర్లేదు.
తెలుగు ఇంగ్లీష్ కలిపి చెప్పినా పర్లేదా? మొత్తం ఇంగ్లీష్లో వద్దా?
మొత్తం
అంటే ఇప్పుడు వరకు నేను మాట్లాడింది మీకు ఏమైనా అర్థమైందా, అర్థం కాలేదా?
అర్థమైందన్న.
ఓకే, అర్థమైతే
ఈ
ట్రై చేద్దాం.
మాట్లాడుతూ నాకు కానీ సబ్జెక్ట్ లోకి వెళ్తే అది కొంచెం వేరే వేరే వర్డ్స్ ఉంటాయి కదా, అవి అంతగా అర్థం కాదు.
సారీ, ఎక్స్క్యూజ్ మీ. వేరే వేరే వర్డ్స్ అంటే ఇప్పుడు మారిపోవు కదరా. ఇప్పుడు ఆ వర్డ్ తెలుగులో అయినా ఆ వర్డే అంటాం, ఇంగ్లీష్లో అయినా. సేల్స్ ఫోర్స్ అని అంటావు కదా తెలుగులో కూడా. సేల్స్ ఫోర్స్ని దాన్ని ఏదన్నా ఒక కొత్త పదం పెట్టి పిలవం కదా, రైట్? సో వర్డ్స్ అన్నీ కూడా మోస్ట్లీ తెలుగులో అయినా ఇంగ్లీష్లో అయినా ఒకలాగే ఉంటాయి. బట్ ఓకే, సో నేను చెప్తాను. చెప్పే ప్రాసెస్లో మీకు ఎక్కడన్నా అర్థం అవ్వట్లేదు అని అనుకుంటే ప్లీజ్ స్టాప్ మీ దెన్ అండ్ దేర్ ఇట్ సెల్ఫ్. ఓకే, సో అప్పుడు నేను కావాలంటే మళ్ళీ దాన్ని తెలుగులో చెప్తాను. ఫైనా? పోనీ అట్లా పర్లేదా? ఓకే, సో ఎందుకోసం అని అంటే, రైట్, సో ద రీజన్ వై ఐ వాస్డ్ రాజేష్ టు టీచ్ ఇన్ తెలుగు ఈజ్ బికాస్ మనం కొత్తగా నేర్చుకుంటున్నాం కాబట్టి మనకి మన మదర్ టంగ్లో మనం నేర్చుకుంటేనే బెటర్గా రిజిస్టర్ అవుతుంది. ఓకే, సో మనం బేసిక్ ఫండమెంటల్స్ అనేవి చాలా చాలా ఇంపార్టెంట్. సో ఆ ఫండమెంటల్స్ దగ్గర మీకు అబ్జార్ప్షన్ బాగుండాలి కాబట్టి నేను తెలుగులో చెప్పమని చెప్పాను. కానీ రేపు పొద్దున్న మనం ఇంటర్వ్యూ ఇవ్వాల్సింది ఇంగ్లీష్లోనే కదా, అవునా? రైట్, సో రేపు పొద్దున్న వెళ్ళి ఆఫీస్లో జాయిన్ అయిన తర్వాత మనం ఎవరికన్నా ఏదైనా చెప్పేటప్పుడన్నా ఇంగ్లీష్లోనే చెప్పాలి కదా. సో కాబట్టి సో ఇంగ్లీష్ కూడా మనకు రావాలి. సో అది ఇప్పటి నుంచి స్టార్ట్ చేశారనుకోండి, స్లోగా యూల్ ఇంప్రూవ్. ఓకే, రైట్. బున్ని, పర్లేదా నీకు? బున్ని
ఓకే అన్నారు,
అర్థమవుతుంది కదా ఇంగ్లీష్లో? నీకేం ప్రాబ్లం లేదుగా? ఓకే, రైట్. సో ఇన్ దట్ కేస్ లెట్ మీ క్విక్లీ షేర్ మై స్క్రీన్. Tell me if you guys can see my screen. Kanipistunda? Right, wonderful. That's great. Then just give me a second. Okay, so if you guys are having any questions or something like that, so don't hesitate to ask me anything. Okay, so please feel free to stop me then and there itself, so that so your doubts will be clarified, right? So don't wait until, so you can ask all the questions once we are done with the class as well. That is also fine. But still, right, so if you feel like if you're not able, you are not able to understand something, and if that is stopping you from understanding the next concepts that we are discussing on that day, so then please feel free to stop me then and there itself. Okay, right, good. So what all things we have in Salesforce development. Okay, so right. So let's take any web application. Okay, not just web application, any application in that matter. 1 second, there is RER. Okay, right. So let's take any web application, so to understand how its architecture would look like, right? So you'll have a front end, right? And then, right, so you'll have a back end, right? So in back end, what all things you'll have? You'll generally have servers, and along with that servers, right? So you'll have database as well. Okay, so both servers and database, so comes into backend, and whatever the end users, right? The people who are using that application. Okay, so whatever the end users, right? That see on their browser, right? Or in their system. Okay, so or in their system, right? So then, right, so we call that as a front end. Okay, so that means the application UI itself, right? So the application UI itself is called as a front end, right? The same way, even for Salesforce also, right? So we have front end and the back end, right? So probably you could have heard about this front end and back end, so when you are learning admin, right? So the same thing goes here as well. Okay, so in development, right? So in coding, right? So in programming, right? So whatever UI elements that we design with the help of code, so that part comes into front end development. Okay, right? So probably, right, so in declarative so programming or whatever it could be, right? So in declarative customization means point and click customizations. What you have done, right? So you have customized user interface with the help of page layouts. Do you guys remember that? Right? So and you have customized or you could have customized so the record detail page or whatever it could be, right? So with the help of Lightning App Builder, right? So these things you have already done. Is that right or wrong? Okay, so these things you have already done, right? So how you have done all of these things? You have done with the help of point and click, right? So point and click functionality, which is declarative, so functionality of Salesforce, right? So now, if you are customizing those pages, right? So the front end, so whatever, so the record detail pages or whatever custom pages that the end user is seeing, right? So if you are customizing or if you are, so building those pages with the help of coding, right? So then that particular thing comes under front end development. Okay, front end development of Salesforce, right? So like any other application, Salesforce also have a front end, right? So if you want to build any front end related so components with the help of code, so then that comes into front end development of Salesforce development, right? So and the same way, right, so we do have something backend, right? So if you have already learned flows, right? So I'm not sure whether you have learned flows or not, right? So if you have already learned flows, then what we generally do with the help of flows, right? So we automate business process with the help of point and click functionalities, right? So what kind of automations we use to, so we can do with the help of flows in general, right? So if you are creating so any record, right, any object related record, right? So it could be account or whatever, so anything, right? It can be any of the objects, right? So if you are creating a record in any of the object, right? So then if you want to so create a task or something like that on that particular record, right? So now we are creating an account record, say for example. Okay, so so SpaceX, right? So you are creating a SpaceX account, right? So this account has been created. So whoever is the owner of that particular account, you want to assign him a task. Say, for example, Ishwar is the owner of that particular account record, right? So the moment that SpaceX account is created, so you want to add or assign a task to Ishwar, right, to contact the, so someone from that particular account. Okay. So you have a task created, right? So how can we do this, right? So we can generally do this with the help of flows. So we call that as record triggered flows, right? So you can, so achieve this particular functionality with the help of record triggered flows, right? So, but so how you will build these flows, right? So you build these kind of flows with the help of point and click functionality. These automations you'll build with the help of point and click functionalities, right? Excuse me, guys. Excuse me. Okay. So the same way, right? So if you want to build, right? So some kind of automations with the help of code, right? So with the help of code, right? So then that comes into backend development, right? Of the Salesforce development, right? So if you are doing it with the help of point and click, so that comes into declarative customization, right? So if you are doing with the help of code, then we call it as programmatic customization. Programmatic means, right, so you are writing code, right, to achieve that particular functionality, right? So to automate things or whatever it could be, right? So that comes into Salesforce backend development. Okay, right. So now let's see what all things that we have in backend development and what all things so we have in the front end development, right? Or whatever things that we'll learn right, so in the backend development and whatever things that we'll learn in the front end development of our Salesforce development. Let's see all of them. Okay, so at a higher level. Okay, right. So in development, right, so there are 6 major areas that we'll cover, right? So in the backend development, there are 6 major areas that so we will be covering. So now let's see what all those areas, right? So it starts with Apex fundamentals. Okay, so it starts with Apex fundamentals. What all things we'll learn in Apex fundamentals, right? So generally, as I just told you, right, so as I just told you, right, that you have to write code in order to achieve any kind of automations, right? So achieve any kind of so customers requirement, right? You have to write code in order to do that, right? So since you are learning coding for the first time, right, so you may not be knowing much details how so a program works, right? So what all what are all the basic building blocks of writing a computer program and all of that, right? So you may not be knowing all of that, right? So these things we'll discuss in Apex fundamentals, right? So first we'll see the programming basics, right? So we'll start learning from how a computer works, right? To a stage where so what all building blocks that we have in any of the programming language, right? So almost every programming language have similar so building blocks or similar kind of structure, I would say, right? So that is something we'll learn in the programming basics, right? So and after that, right, so we'll learn object oriented programming structure. Okay, system, right? So not the structure, object oriented programming system concepts, right? So OOPS concepts we call it. Okay, so there are 2 ways of writing so any code, right? So one is procedural oriented and the other one is object oriented. So you don't need to worry about what is procedural oriented and what is object oriented and all of that. So we'll so discuss that in more detail so when we discuss the OOPS concepts, right? So these are some of the concepts that we have to learn. Why? Because right, so Apex is also a object oriented programming language. Okay, so these are all things we learn so in the Apex fundamentals. Along with this, right, so how so you have to write your basic programs in Apex programming language, right? So that also we learn while learning programming basics and OOPS concepts. Okay, so that is the part 1, right? So and then next goes to SOQL, SOSL, or DML. Okay, so what all things we'll have in SOQL, SOSL, or DML. Okay, so now, right, so here in Apex Fundamentals, we'll be learning the basics of programming language, right? So as I just told you earlier, right? So we'll just only learn the basics of programming language, like Apex programming. But here what we'll learn is, right? So we'll learn how to fetch data, right? How to fetch data from the, right? So Salesforce database, right? How to fetch data from the Salesforce database, right? So that is what we learn in SOQL. SOQL means Salesforce Object Query Language, right? So those full forms and all of that. So you'll remember when we discuss more on SOQL and SOL related topics, right? So using SOQL, you'll learn, so all the ways through which you can fetch the data from Salesforce database. Okay, so you generally, right, the fetch data, right, what you'll have, right, you'll have rows of records, right? How does data get stored in Salesforce, right? So data stores in the form of records, right? So those records you'll pull from the database, right? So that is something we'll learn from. So you'll have both standard objects and custom objects in our Salesforce database, right? So standard objects means, right, so they could be so account, right? So contact, right? So lead, right? So custom objects means, right, whatever objects that you would be creating for yourself based on the requirements that you are getting, right? So we'll learn, right? So the data that we are fetching, right, that can be from either standard objects or from custom objects, right? So we'll see how we can fetch the data from standard objects, custom objects, and blah blah blah, and then many more other things, right? So it is all about fetching the data, right? It is all about fetching the data. That is what this SOQL is all about. Okay, so that's what we'll learn here. And after that, right, so we'll learn DML and database methods. Okay, what is this DML? DML means data manipulation language, right? So you don't need to worry much about this, so DML as well at this point in time, but just try to understand what this DML is all about, right? So in SOQL, we are fetching the data, right? So fetching the data is not just enough, right? So after fetching the data, what we generally do, right, we'll modify it, or we'll update that particular data, or using that particular data, right, so we may create some other records, right? So we may want to create some other records in another object or whatever it would, right? So these are the things that we want to do, right? So that means, so what you are doing, right? So you are updating, what you are doing, you are updating the data that you have received, right, again back into the database, right? So either you are so either you want to insert some new records, right? So that means insertion, what all things that we can generally do on database, right? So we can insert the record, right? So that means creation of the records. We can update the records, right? So and then what more we can do, what more can we do, right? So we can update the records, we can insert the records, right? And we can upsert the records, right? Upsert means insert plus update, right? So these kind of operations, right? So how we can do, right? So how can we do, right? So all of that we learn within this DML and database methods, right? So now you have fetched the data, you have modified it with the help of Apex, right? So and then you are again saving all of that back into the database, right? So to save that data back into the database, right? So to perform insert or update or upsert kind of operations, then we use DML statements. So that thing also we'll learn. Okay, right? So and after that, right, so we'll learn Apex best practices, right? So so if you are if you are able to so go to this extent, right? So then you can consider yourself like so Salesforce developer, right? So now since you have learned the programming and how to write so Apex program and how to fetch the data and how to update the data back into the database and all of that, right? You should be knowing the best practices as well, right? So if you are not following the best practices, then what will happen, right? So it will reduce the so your org's efficiency. Okay, it will reduce your org's efficiency, right? So in order to so make your org perform well, you should always make sure that you're following best practices in the coding, right? So that particular thing we'll learn in the Apex best practices. Okay, so in Apex best practices, right, you will have you'll learn something called event handling, governor limits, right? Sorry, exception handling, governor limits, and bulkification and all of that. Okay. So, and after that, Apex triggers, right? So what is Apex triggers, right? So triggers is all about, right? So whenever you are, creating a record, right? So whenever you are creating a record on any of the objects, right? So if you want something to happen, so some actions, to happen in the background, right? So that could be like creation of a task, right? So updation of, so child records, right? So, or maybe some other thing, right? So if you want these kind of things, right? So then what we do, right? So we will do that with the help of what? Triggers, right? So not just at the time of creation of the record, right? So at the time of updating of a record also, if you want something to run in the background, right? So you can do that with the help of triggers, right? So the same way, right? So while deleting a record also, right? So if you want something to perform in the background, right? So we will do all of that with the help of triggers. Okay. So that triggers also will learn. Okay. So, and after that, right? So we have something called asynchronous Apex, right? So this asynchronous Apex is also called as future Apex as well, right? Not future Apex, right? So within the asynchronous Apex, there are, so different type of Apex, right? So that is, so future Apex, right? So batch Apex, queuable Apex, right? So scheduled Apex and all of that. Okay. So, but what this future Apex, batch Apex, queuable Apex, scheduled or schedulable Apex. So we'll see all of that in our future classes when we discuss asynchronous Apex. Okay. But at a higher level, for your understanding, right? So I'll tell you what asynchronous Apex is, right? So generally we have two types of, so transactions, guys, Apex transactions. Whenever a particular, a piece of code is executed, right? So that transaction, so can be, so divided into two types, right? So one is synchronous transaction, right? So, and the other one is, right? So if there are any spelling mistakes, please, so excuse me, right? So asynchronous Apex, right? So, or asynchronous transaction, right? So you'll have two types of transactions. What is the synchronous transaction and what is this asynchronous transaction? Let's, so quickly look into that, right? So whenever you are running a piece of code, right? So you are executing a piece of code, right? If the code, right, compiles and performs whatever task that you have written, right? So in that particular piece of code, if all of those tasks are, getting executed the moment you initiate that particular transaction, right? So then we call that as synchronous transaction. Okay. So you have initiated the transaction, and the moment you have initiated the transaction, it will start executing, right? So once that is executed, right? So whatever actions that you want to perform, right? So whatever actions that you want to perform, right? So if those actions are getting performed then and there itself, then we call that as a synchronous transaction. Okay. So, and then, right? So on the other hand, we have something called asynchronous transaction. What this asynchronous transaction is, right? So you have initiated the transaction, the execution, right? So the execution also has started, but it will not perform all the actions that you have written in that particular piece of code, right? So the very next moment you have initiated, it will wait for the system resource availability, system resources availability. Okay. So what is the system resources availability means, right? Say for example, you have 1,000 so users in your org. Okay. 1,000 users in your org, and all of those 1,000 users are using Salesforce, right? So for their day in day out sales and marketing operations, say for example, this is what happening in your Salesforce org. Okay. So now, right, so if you have initiated a particular so transaction, right? So and if that transaction needs lot of resources in order to so get executed, then what will happen, right? So it will consume all of your org's resources. Okay. Resources in the sense, what kind of resources, right? So bandwidth and all other things. Okay, so whatever limits that Salesforce has given, right? So all of those limits will be consumed, mostly will be consumed by right? So the transaction that you have initiated, say for example, if that is going to happen, then what will happen, right? So the performance of all of these 1,000 users will be degraded. Is that right or wrong? Is it right or wrong, guys? Right? So if you I mean, like, so if all of your resources are utilized by one of the transactions, right? So while all other 1,000 users are so working on their leads or cases or whatever it could be, so then what will happen, right? So the performance of the end users will be reduced. I mean, the performance of the Salesforce for the end users will be reduced. So if you are having such type of transactions, right? So then if I mean, generally what so we want to do, right? We want them to run at later stage, right? So later stage when no users are using the system. Okay, so then what will happen, right? So if we are so performing the transaction at the later stages after business hours or whatever it could be, then right, so what will happen is that, right, it will not impact your performance, system's performance. And since no one is using, right, even if it takes 5 hours or 6 hours or 10 hours, right, so to get the whole transaction to be completed, right, so it will get executed without any issue. Why? Because that is out of business hours, right? So that way, if you want something to run whenever the system resources are available, okay, whenever the system resources are available, right, so that means whenever there is no much load on your Salesforce, or whenever there are so no much users that are using your Salesforce, or right, so at that point in time, so if you want your transactions to be executed, so then you will run your transaction in the asynchronous mode, right? So that kind of transactions, we call it as asynchronous transactions. Okay, so to create those kind of asynchronous related executions, right, so code or whatever it could be, so we use asynchronous epochs, right? So we'll learn all of that here in the asynchronous epochs, right? So till epoch triggers, whatever you learn, right, all of that is considered under synchronous epochs, right? So but whereas asynchronous epochs is entirely different, where you learn right, so how to run the code or how to execute the code in right, synchronous mode, to make sure that the whatever code that you have written is executing only when the system resources are available, right? That thing we'll learn in asynchronous epochs, right? So now you have learned all the coding, right? By the time you learn asynchronous epochs, right, you can consider yourself like you have learned all the coding. But whatever code that you have written, right, so that will work fine within your sandbox, or maybe so within your developer edition, right? So within your developer edition, right? So but if you want that code, right, so to be pushed into production environment, right? So if you want that code to be pushed into the production environment so that end users also can start using it, so then you should, I mean, so you should make sure that whatever code that you have written, right, so that code is tested, right? So how can you test that code, right? So generally, to test a functionality, we can do it in two different ways, right? So one is manual way, right? So right, so whatever functionality that you want to test, right, so what you'll do, right, so you'll test that manually. You will see whether that particular functionality is working or not. Okay, the same way, whereas, right, so you have a way to test that functionality using code as well. Okay, so but that is so only for the code related functionalities, whatever functionalities that you have built using Apex, right? So using Apex, right, so right, so we have to make sure that we are testing that code before pushing it into any of the production instances, and that too not only through manual mode, right? So you have to test that through so code as well, right? So that testing, right, so we learn it in the Apex testing. Okay, so whatever functionality that you generally build, right, so using all the concepts that you I mean, like that you have learned, right, till here, or that you will be learning till here, so all of that code, right, so you have to test it with the help of, right, so Apex so test methods and all of that. So that kind of thing, right? And so that testing thing, we'll see it in the Apex testing. Okay, so these are all the things that we'll learn throughout our Salesforce development, backend development related, so program, right? So, and after that, right, so we'll start learning front-end development as well, so which is purely related to LWC. Okay, so I'm not discussing much more about this at this point in time. So, but when we start learning, so Lightning Web Component, so then, or when we start learning front-end development, so right, we'll see what all things that so we'll be learning in the front-end development of Salesforce, right? So now let's start with Apex fundamentals. Okay, is it clear, guys, so far? Guys, is it clear so far, or do you have any questions? అరే అన్ని అర్థమైనాయా, లేకపోతే ఏమైనా డౌట్లు ఏమైనా ఉన్నాయా? ఇప్పుడు వరకు మనం చెప్పుకున్న దాంట్లో ఏమైనా అర్థం కాకపోతే చెప్పండి, మాట్లాడతాం. బాబు మాట్లాడు.
No doubts.
How about others, guys? How about others? How about others? How about others? అర్థమవుతుందా? బున్ని, నీకు అర్థమవుతుందా?
అర్థమవుతుంది.
ఓకే, ఇంకెవరున్నారు? Who all we have? Okay, Robert. Okay, I cannot ask each and every one, right? So name by name. So if you guys are able to understand what I'm saying, right? So నేను ఏదైనా క్వశ్చన్ అడిగేటప్పుడు అందరూ రెస్పాండ్ అవ్వండి. Okay, so this is something I am expecting from all of you people. So I'm not really sure, like, how you have responded to Rajesh Anna, but my teaching is different, right? So his teaching is different. So నాకు మీరు రెస్పాండ్ అవ్వట్లేదు అనుకోండి, నేను గోడకు చెప్పుకునేటట్టు ఉంటే నాకు చెప్పడానికి ఇంట్రెస్ట్, మోటివేషన్ రాదు. నాకు మోటివేషన్, ఇంట్రెస్ట్ ఎప్పుడు వస్తుంది అంటే మీరు కూడా యాక్టివ్గా ఉండి, మీరు కూడా ఏ రోజుకి ఆ రోజు హ్యాండ్స్ ఆన్ ఎక్సర్సైజ్లు కంప్లీట్ చేసుకుంటే నాకు మోటివేషన్ వస్తుంది, నాకు చెప్పాలనిపిస్తుంది. ఓకే, రైట్. సో ప్లీజ్ రెస్పాండ్. Don't be passive, so learners, or don't be just simply passive, right? Okay, so now let's jump in. Okay, so now let's start with our Apex fundamentals. Okay, right. So now let's start with our first topic, or the first concept of the Salesforce backend development, right? So Apex fundamentals. Now let's start with programming basics and the OOPS concept, right? So these are the things that we will be learning in the Apex fundamentals. That is already I've told you, right? That is already I've told you. Okay, so now let's see what all things we'll learn in the programming basics. Okay, so we'll start with so learning what programming is all about. Okay, so and then we'll learn what all programming building blocks that we have, right? How to write simple programs and all of that. So those things, so we'll learn in the programming basics. Okay, so now let's see what is programming, right? So if you want to learn, I mean, like, so if you need to know, right, so what programming is, then you need to know, right, so how a computer works. Okay, so you must know how a computer works, right? So let's see this particular picture, right? So if you look at this picture, right, so this generally so gives us high level information on how a computer works. Okay, so what generally happens, right? So you'll have input devices, right? So in a computer, what all things will have? You'll have input devices in the sense what, right? So keyboard, right? Mouse, right? So and the same way, and there are many others as well, right? So and then what happens, right? So you'll give some kind of input, right? So through your input devices, right, to your computer, and you'll ask your computer to perform a particular task, right? You'll ask your computer to perform a particular task, right? The task can be anything, right? So the task can be anything that a computer can do, Okay, so if you are asking, so it to perform a particular task, right? So it will start performing that particular task, and then it will give the output, right? So it will give that output after completing the particular task, right? So what it will do, it will give us the output, right? So through what? Output devices, right? So it will give us the output through output devices. What are the output devices that we generally have in a computer, right? So we'll have, tell me, what all we'll have, right? So we have a monitor, speakers we have, right? So, and many more, right? So these are the output devices, right? So there we can see the output, right? So based on whatever computer has processed. Okay, so now say for example, right? So this is the output I said, right? So now say for example, right? So you're giving two numbers, right? So number 1 and number 2, right? So number 1 is 5 and number 2 is 3 or something like that, and you are asking the computer to add both the numbers and give the final output. Okay, so now what will happen, right? So at the time of processing, right, so whatever input that you are giving, right, so that input will be stored in main or internal memory. Okay, first what will happen is that input will go to this main or internal memory, which is also called as RAM, right? So random access memory. Okay, so now what will happen, right? So this 5 and 3 will be so will be stored in this RAM, right? So the number 1 and number 2 will be stored in the RAM. So and after that, right, so that number 1 and number 2, this central processing unit, the CPU will take that and it will process it, right? So what it will do, right, so it will add those numbers. That is what we have asked, right? So it will add those numbers, and so whatever output that we are getting, right, so then what it will do, right, so that output again, so it will share it back with RAM, and it will store that output in the main or internal memory in the RAM memory. Okay, and then it will display that via output device, right? So then what will happen, right? So it will do the calculation here, right? So it will store that 5 and 3 here within this RAM, right? So in RAM, right? So this is how so you'll have a lot of memory slots, right? So it will store those numbers as 5 somewhere and 3 somewhere, and then it will take those numbers, right, from the RAM, right, and it will process them, right? So it will add that 5 plus 3 here, right? So whatever output that so we get, right, so it will store that output somewhere again in the RAM, and then it will display that through the output device, right? So this is how so any so what computer works, right? So it will take the input, and if there is anything that needs to be stored while processing so that particular input, right, so it will store that input in the RAM or the main memory, and it will access those inputs and then process it, and again it will store that it will store that output in the RAM, and then it will display, or it will give us as an output. Okay, so that's how a computer works. Okay, so now what is a program, right? So now we have seen, right? So this is how a computer works, right? So then how it generally works, right? So it works through set of instructions, right? So what we are doing, right, so we are giving some set of instructions, and we are asking the CPU to follow those instructions. Okay, and just CPU is following those instructions and performing whatever task that we are asking it to perform, right? So now these set of instructions, we call it as a program. Okay, so whatever set of instructions that you give, right, so to your computer, so that we call it as a program. Okay, right? So now what is a computer? Computer is a what? Computer is what? Computer is a electronic device, right? So since that is an electronic device, right, so what it generally understands, right, so it will understand only zeros and ones, right? So electronic devices, right, so can understand only power on and power off, right? So they can only know power on and power off, right? So power on is considered as 1, right? So power off is considered as 0, right? So that is a binary, right? So only a computer and any electronic device for that matter, our phones and all of that, right? Our phone is also a computer, right? So now, so all of these electronic devices only understand zeros and ones, right? So now whatever instructions that you are giving, right? So those instructions we cannot give it in zeros and ones, right? So we are humans at the end of the day. So do you really think, right, we'll be able to share the instructions in the form of zeros and ones in whichever language that computer understands, right? So computer generally understands this zeros and ones only, right? So this we call it as binary language. Okay, so binary language or machine language, whatever it would be, right? So machine language, right? So only machine can understand this particular language, but we cannot, right? So even if we want to pass some instructions, we cannot pass our instructions in the binary form, right? So for that reason, right, so we have something called compiler. Okay, so what do we have, right? So what we'll have, right, so we'll have something called compiler. So what this compiler generally does, right, so this compiler will take the instructions, right? So we'll take the instructions, right? So what does the instructions means, right? So what I mean, like, so what do we call that, right? So that set of instructions, we call it as a program, right? So it will take that set of instructions, right? So these instructions will pass it in, right, our own understandable language, right? So our own understandable language, which is English, right? So we'll pass these instructions. Then what will happen, right? So these instructions will be passed to the compiler. So compiler will convert these instructions into machine code, right? So which is zeros and ones, right? So it will convert that into machine language, so that whatever instructions that we are giving, right, so machine will be able to understand that, and it will perform those operations accordingly. Okay, so it will perform those tasks accordingly. Okay, so now this is machine language, and so this is also called as binary language, and this is also called as low level language. Okay, low level language. And whatever right, so instructions that we are giving through our program, right, so we call that as high level language. Okay, we call that as what? High level language, right? So there are multiple high level languages that are available in the world today, right? So Java is one of such language, right? So and Python is one of such language, right? So C is one of such language. C++ is one of such language, and even Apex is also one of such language, right? So each and every language will work on different set of computers and then different set of platforms, right? So they have their own compilers. Okay, why? Because at the end of the day, what compiler does, right? So whatever instructions that we are giving, right, so it will convert that instructions of the high level language, right, so into low level language, right, so which is zeros and ones, right? So that way, that means, right, so now each and every compiler is different, right? Each and every compiler is different. But at the end of the day, what these compilers will do, right? So these compilers will compile or will convert the high level language into the low level language, right? So Java will have its own compiler, Python will have its own compiler, C and C++ will have their own compilers and interpreters, right? Even Apex also will have its own set of compiler, right? So compiler is nothing but like language translator. Okay, so say for example, right, so I mean, like, so you are from, I mean, like, so you're going to Africa. Okay, so to give a speech or something like that from India to Africa, right? So, and the only language that you know is, right, so Hindi, say for example. But right, so you have to pass your message to the African people. Then how you can so pass your message? With the help of some kind of translator, isn't it so? Right, so you will do that with the help of some kind of translator. The translator should know both Hindi and, right, so that African language, whatever African language, I mean, like, so whatever African language that is, right? So he should be knowing both the languages, so that whatever information that you are sharing, he will translate that into their language, right? So this is what a compiler is all about, right? So compiler should know both the languages. So that's why, right, so we can have different type of different translators, right? So if you don't know English, then you can have English translator who can help you to communicate with English people, right? So those English people can be anyone, right? So that way, right? So you should have a different translator. So that way, right? So for Java, you'll have a different translator. Sorry, translator means compiler, right? So for Python, you'll have a different one. And Apex also, you'll have a different one. Okay. So now we know what a program is all about, right? So program is a set of instructions given to a computer to perform a particular task. Now, what is Apex, right? So that also we have just learned, right? So what is Apex, right? So Apex is a high-level programming language, right? So it's a high-level programming language that runs or that executes, all right? So that executes on top of Salesforce platform. Which platform, guys? On top of Salesforce platform. Only on top of Salesforce platform, this Apex works, right? So this Apex programming will not work anywhere outside of the Salesforce platform. Okay. So as I just told you, right, so Java will run only on certain type of systems or on certain type of environments, right? So the same way Python will run on certain type of systems and certain type of, environments, right? The same way, even our Apex also can run only on top of Salesforce platform. Okay. So, but this is also one of the high level languages, one of the object oriented programming language, right? Object oriented programming language, right? One of the object oriented programming languages that run on top of Salesforce platform, right? So that is what Apex is all about, right? Using Apex, right? So you can do anything within Salesforce, right? So you can fetch the records, you can, so update the records, you can modify those records, right? So whatever you want to do with the data that is there in Salesforce, right? So you can do all sorts of things with the help of, so Apex, right? So that is what this Apex is all about. Is it clear, guys, so far? Guys, is it clear so far?
Yeah.
Okay, right, good. So now let's look at the programming building blocks. Okay. So as I told you, right? So not just Apex, right? So every programming language so we'll have similar kind of building blocks. Okay. So every programming language will have similar kind of, building blocks, right? Right. So that building blocks we'll learn. Okay, but but they'll be majorly related to Apex, right? So now let's look at Apex programming building blocks, what all things that we have in Apex. But these building blocks, right? So whatever building blocks that we would be learning here, right? So those building blocks would be similar across all the programming languages, right? So whether it is so Java or whether it is Python, right? Whether it is C or C++, right? So anything, any high level programming language, right? So these are the building blocks that we'll have, right? So now let's look into all of them in more detail. But most of the, so most of the times, right? So we'll see things that are purely related to Apex, right? So even though the building blocks are same, right? So now let's start with variables and constants, right? So these are all the building blocks that we have, right? So we have variables and constants, right? So data types, right? So statement and expressions, right? So operators, right? So conditional statements, loops and collections. So these are similar across, so most of the programming languages, right? So, but the way you declare them, the way you define them, the way you, so execute them is little different in each and every programming language, but the blocks are same. Okay. So now let's start with variables and constants. Okay. So now let's start with variables and constants in this. So let's look at what a variable is. Okay. So what is a variable, right? So generally, right? So if you look at the previous example, right? So the one that we have seen earlier, right? So what we have done, right? So we have given two numbers, right? So we have given two numbers as input, right? So number 1 and number 2, right? So we have given two numbers, right? So number 1 and number 2 as 5 and what is the other one, right? So as 3, right? So after that, what we have asked our, so computer to do, right? So we have asked our computer to add both of those numbers and give us that output, which is 8. Okay. So now this is the task that we are asking, so our computer to perform. Okay, so in this case, what happens, right? So as I told you, what will happen, right? So this input, whatever input that we are passing here to our CPU, right? So what our CPU will do first, it will send that to RAM. That's what I've told you, right? So while executing that particular program, right? So while executing those instructions, right? So what it will do, it will take those two inputs and it will store those inputs in the RAM until that particular program is executed. Okay, until that particular, so until we are done with that program's execution, right? So it will store those numbers in the RAM. Okay, so it will store somewhere, right? As a 5 will get stored somewhere, and 3 also will get stored somewhere. And whatever output that we are getting, so after the data is processed, so that also will store somewhere. Okay, so so it will store somewhere, and then again, right? So it will access that particular data, and it will give that as an output, right? So this is what we have seen. Okay, so now what is variable here, right? So in this overall program execution, what is variable, right? So this number 1 and number 2, right? So we have given as 5 and 3, right? We have given as 5 and 3. So while executing it for the first time, right? So what if I want to give that as 50 and 30 second time? So then what will happen, right? So then it will again take that 50 and the 30, and it will store that 50 and 30 somewhere, and then it will add both of them, and it will again give the output. It will again store that output somewhere, right? So as 50, and this one as 50, and this one as 30, and it will show that output somewhere, and again it will give that output, right? So as 50 plus 30 as 80, right? So now if you look at this, right? So this is a variable. Okay, so this is a variable. Variable means what, right? So what the RAM is, what CPU is doing, right? So it is allocating a memory. That is what it is doing, right? So a variable is a location capable of storing temporary data within the program. So while executing the program, right? So what a variable will generally does, right? So it will store that input data temporarily, right? So temporarily until that particular program is executed. Okay, so once that is done, what happened, right? So after that, again we can pass some two different numbers, right? So now we are passing 50 and 30. Now what happened, right? So now that particular the data that we are storing in that particular memory location got changed entirely, right? So that way, whenever you want to change it, every time you're executing, you can change them. And at the same time, while executing that program, right? So what can be done, right? So if you want these numbers, so if your CPU want to so access those numbers, it can access those numbers. If it want, so if your CPU want to modify those numbers in between, right? So it can modify those numbers, right? So and if your CPU want to display that numbers, right? So once the program is done at the end of the program, so it can do that, right? So that particular memory location, right? So we call it as a variable, right? So that means what? So into this location, you can store any value every time you are executing that program, right? So that is what it is. A variable is a location capable of storing temporary data, right? So first time when you're executing, you're passing 5 and 3. So that's a temporary data. So again, you're passing 50 and 30, right? So now, right? So again, it's a temporary data, right? Until that program is executed, so it will hold that data, right? So those things we will call them as variables, right? So what all things can be done on variables, right? So please look into that, right? So this data, right? Whatever data that we are storing, right? So within, into that location while that program is executing, that data can be modified, right? So while that program is executing, that can be modified, or right, so that can be stored into some another memory location or in the same memory location, whatever it could be, and that can be displayed as well. Okay, so if you want, you can display that also whenever needed within the overall program execution. That's what we call it, right? So in this case, what happens, right? So that number 1 and number 2 are the variables. Is that clear, guys? Right, so now let's take A is equals to 5, B is equals to 3, C is equals to A plus B, right? So now tell me what happened here, right? So now A is a variable, B is a variable, and C is also a variable. Okay, so now, right, if you are executing this for the first time, right, so you may give whatever numbers you want to give, right? So if I'm executing for the first time, right? So I am giving 5, 3. Now 5 plus 3 will be 8, right? So now if you want to print this, print C, right? So or something like that. So what will happen, right? So whatever, so the number that you'll get as an output in this A plus B, so that number will be printed here, right? So if you want, I mean, since these are the variables, right? So you can change them at any point in time. You want to change, right? So if I want to change this, what can I do, right? So I can give, so A is equal to 50, B is equal to 30, then A plus B will become as 80. Okay, so that's what the variable is all about. Okay, so is it clear, guys? At least theoretically, guys, is it clear? At least theoretically.
Yeah, yes, sir.
Okay, so now let's so write our first program in our Salesforce Developer Console. Okay, so now let's start with our first program. Let me just simply come here, right? So let me log in into our Salesforce org. Okay. Okay, so since it is taking some time, let me click on this. What the heck? Why it's taking this much time? Okay, so create a separate playground for this, guys. For so whatever so development that we are learning, right? So throughout this program, whenever needed, right? Create your own new orgs, right? So let me name this as Salesforce Development. So it's taking some time, right? Since we are creating a new org, sometimes it will take a couple of minutes, right? So let's wait till then. Okay, right. So meanwhile, let's go back to our so presentation, right, and see what all other things that we have, right? So is it clear, guys? Right, at least at a higher level, what a variable is. Is it clear, or do you have any questions? Can I go to the next topic? We'll see all of this once that org is created, right? So we'll write all of so these things. But at least is it clear theoretically? At a higher level, at least. బాబు మాట్లాడాలమ్మా బాబా పిల్లలు మాట్లాడాలి మాట్లాడాలా పిలుస్తున్నప్పుడు ఈజీ క్లియర్ అన్నప్పుడు క్లియర్ అంటే క్లియర్ అనో లేకపోతే అర్థం కాకపోతే అర్థం కాలేదనో చెప్పాలి. ఓకే, రైట్. సో దెన్ వీ హ్యావ్ సంథింగ్ కాల్డ్ కాన్స్టెంట్, రైట్? సో వాట్ ఈస్ కాన్స్టెంట్? సో కాన్స్టెంట్ కూడా వేరియబుల్ లాగే పనిచేస్తుంది. కాకపోతే డిఫరెన్స్ ఏంటి అని అంటే, రైట్, సో ఆ ప్రోగ్రామ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అవ్వటం స్టార్ట్ అయినప్పుడు, రైట్, సో ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అవ్వటం స్టార్ట్ అయ్యేటప్పుడు నువ్వు ఆ కాన్స్టెంట్కి ఏ వాల్యూ అయితే నువ్వు సెట్ చేసావో సో అదే వాల్యూ ఉండిపోతుంది అన్నమాట. ఓకే, సో ఆ ప్రోగ్రామ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూషన్ అయ్యేంత వరకు కూడా ఆ వాల్యూ, అందులో ఉన్న వాల్యూ నువ్వు చేంజ్ చేయలేవు. సో జనరల్గా వేరియబుల్స్ ఏంటి, రైట్? సో A ఈజ్ ఈక్వల్స్ టు 5 అని పెట్టాను, రైట్? సో B ఈజ్ ఈక్వల్స్ టు 3 అని పెట్టాను, రైట్? సో C ఈజ్ ఈక్వల్స్ టు A ప్లస్ B అని చెప్పి పెట్టి నేనేమో దీన్ని ప్రింట్ చేశాను, ప్రింట్ C చేశాను. ఓకే, తర్వాత అదే ప్రోగ్రామ్లోని what I can do is, right, so general గా అయితే, okay, what I can do is I can so change the values in A, right? I can change the value of A to some 6, right? So I can change the value of B to some 3, right? So again నేను ఏం చేయొచ్చు అని అంటే, right? So C is equals to, right? So A into B అని కూడా నేను కావాలంటే పెట్టుకోవచ్చు, పెట్టుకొని ప్రింట్ C అని కూడా నేను చేయొచ్చు. సో అప్పుడు ఏమవుతుంది నాకు, రైట్? ఇక్కడ 8 వస్తుంది, రైట్? సో ఇక్కడేమో సీన్ ప్రింట్ చేస్తే ఎంత వస్తుంది లాస్ట్లో నాకు? టెల్ మీ. 6 into 3 18 వస్తుంది, అవునా కదా? రైట్? సో ఇప్పుడు ఫస్ట్ ఏమవుతుంది, ఫస్ట్ ఏలోకి 5 వెళ్తుంది, తర్వాత బీలోకి 3 వెళ్తుంది, తర్వాత ఈ లైన్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అవుతుంది. ఈ లైన్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అయినప్పుడు, రైట్? సో A ప్లస్ బిని రెండింటిని కలిపేస్తుంది, 5ని 3ని కలిపేస్తుంది, 8 అవుతుంది. సీని ప్రింట్ చేసేటప్పుడు 8 అని ప్రింట్ చేస్తుంది. ఇప్పుడు నేను ఏలోకి 6 పెట్టాను, సో ఈ శ్రీని కూడా ప్రింట్ చేసేది 8 ప్రింట్ అయిపోతుంది. తర్వాత ఇట్ విల్ గో టు ద నెక్స్ట్ లైన్, right? So then what will happen, right? So A will, I mean, like, so we are storing 6 into A now, right? So and we are storing 3 into B now, right? So and then again what we are doing, so we are changing the value of C, right? So which is right, so which is A into B, and then we are printing that C. So now what will happen, right? So this 6 into 3 will become 18, right? But if you look at the whole execution, right? If you look at the whole execution, right? So what we have done, right? So we have changed the values, right? So we have changed the values of the so A and B. Okay, so why, right? So why? Because these are variables, right? So what is a variable? Variable can store the temporary data. It can store the temporary, it is storing the data, right? And at the same time, so in that execution we can change the data as well, right? So modified means we can change the data as well, right? So what we have done, right? So we have changed that data as well, right? So we have modified the data in that A memory location, right? So to 6, and B memory location to 3, right? So at this point in time, right? So in this overall execution, and then what we have done, right? So we have displayed that as well, right? So C ni em chestam, eppudu kavalఅనుకుంటే అప్పుడు డిస్ప్లే చేస్తాం. C ni we have displayed at 1 2 3 4th line, right? So while executing the 4th line, and again we have displayed the C at 1 2 3 4, right? So 4 plus 4 8, right? So at 8th line also we have displayed that C. That means we can do all of this. But whereas if it is a constant, then what will happen is that, right? If you're so declaring something as a constant, right? And if you are setting some value, right, into that constant, then you cannot change that value throughout the execution of your program, right? You can never change the value throughout the execution of your program. But at the time of right, so initiating the program, right, you can pass whatever value that you want to pass. Okay, say for example, right? So let me take one of the constants that we know, right? So which is pi. Pi తెలుసు కదా అందరికి, right? So what is the value of pi? 3.14, right? 3.14. So does pi value changes, right? So it will never change, right? So అలాంటప్పుడు మనం ఏం చేయొచ్చు, right? So ఇలాంటి కాన్స్టెంట్ వాల్యూస్ ఎప్పుడైనా మనం వాడాలి అని అనుకునేటప్పుడు, right? So we can declare them as constants, right? So we can declare them as constants. So in each and every programming language you can declare a constant in a different way, but in Salesforce, if you want to declare something as a constant, we'll use some keyword called final. Okay, so if you are using final keyword, it will become as a constant, right? We'll see all of that once that org is created. We'll see all of that, right? So now what will happen here, right? So if you are declaring something as a constant, right, you cannot change that in the execution of your program, right? You can set any value into it, right, at the time of initiation of the program. But so once the program starts executing, right, so you will never be able to modify it, right? So here we were able to modify A comma B, right? But here if you are declaring something as a constant, you'll not be able to change that. Say for example, if I have changed, right, so if I have so made A as constant, then what will happen, right? If I make A as constant, then what will happen is that A లో 5 గాని పెట్టాను అనుకోండి స్టార్టింగ్ లో, రైట్? సో దాన్ని ఏమవుతుంది అని అంటే, ఏలో 5 ఉంటుంది, బీలో 3 ఉంటుంది, బాగానే ఉంటుంది. C ఈజ్ ఈక్వల్ టు A ప్లస్ బి అవుతుంది. మనం సీన్ ప్రింట్ చేస్తే, రైట్, సో వైల్ ప్రింటింగ్ C, ఇట్ విల్ గివ్ us అవుట్పుట్ యాజ్ 8, రైట్? సో దట్ ఈస్ ఆల్సో ఫైన్, రైట్? సో బట్, రైట్, ఇఫ్ యు ఆర్ ట్రైయింగ్ టు సో ఓవర్ రైట్ ద వాల్యూ, రైట్, ఆఫ్ A with 6, రైట్? ఇప్పుడు నువ్వు దాన్ని మారుద్దాం అని అనుకున్నావు అనుకోండి, 5 కాస్త 6 చేద్దాం అని అనుకున్నావు అనుకోండి, మారదు, రైట్? సో ఇప్పుడు బీలో నేను 5 పెట్టాను అనుకోండి, రైట్? సో ఇట్ విల్ చేంజ్. వై? బికాస్, రైట్, సో B is a regular variable, but A is a constant. A constant కాబట్టి ఇక్కడ A నేను 6 చేస్తే A లోకి 6 వెళ్ళదు, 6 వెళ్ళకుండా ఏమని అంటదంటే, బాబు ఇది నువ్వు ఆల్రెడీ కాన్స్టెంట్ కింద డిక్లేర్ చేసావు కాబట్టి కాన్స్టెంట్లో వాల్యూలు నువ్వు మార్చలేవు, నువ్వు స్టార్టింగ్లో ఏ వాల్యూ ఇచ్చావో ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అయ్యేంత వరకు ఆ వాల్యూనే ఉండాలి అని చెప్తానంటది. అప్పుడు ఏం చేయాలి నువ్వు? ఖచ్చితంగా నువ్వు దీన్ని మార్చడానికి లేదనమాట. అప్పుడు ఏం చేస్తావు? మహా అయితే బీలో వాల్యూని చేంజ్ చేయగలుగుతావు. యూ కెన్ ఓన్లీ చేంజ్ ద వాల్యూ దట్ ఈస్ దేర్ ఇన్ బి. రైట్ నౌ ఇఫ్ యూ ఆర్ చేంజింగ్, ఇఫ్ యూ ఆర్ సిన్స్ యూ ఆర్ చేంజింగ్ ద వాల్యూ ఆఫ్ బి, రైట్, సో నౌ వాట్ విల్ హ్యాపెన్, రైట్, సో ఇఫ్ యూ ఆర్ ప్రింటింగ్ సి, దెన్ వాట్ విల్ హ్యాపెన్? ఇక్కడ ఈ సీన్ ప్రింట్ చేస్తే ఇప్పుడు 8th లైన్ దగ్గరికి వచ్చేటప్పటికి ఇప్పుడు 8 లైన్స్ అవ్వవు, 7 లైన్స్ అవుతాయి. ఎందుకంటే మధ్యలో అది మార్చడానికి లేదు కాబట్టి 7 లైన్స్ అయిపోయి. ఇప్పుడు 7th లైన్ దగ్గరికి వచ్చేటప్పటికి ఏం ప్రింట్ అయితే చెప్పండి? వాట్ విల్ బి ద అవుట్పుట్? ఏలో 5 ఉంటుంది, 5ని మార్చలేకపోయాం, బిలో 5 ఉంది, రైట్, సి ఈజ్ ఈక్వల్ టు ఏ ఇంటూ బి అంటే 5 into 5 విచ్ విల్ కమ్ యాజ్ 25. ఓకే, సో దాట్స్ వాట్ కాన్స్టెంట్ ఇస్. కాన్స్టెంట్ అంటే ఏంటంటే, రైట్, సో ఆ ప్రోగ్రామ్ నువ్వులో ఒక్కసారి కానీ దాన్ని ఇనిషియేట్ చేసి దాంట్లో ఒక వాల్యూ పెట్టవు అని అంటే దట్ వాల్యూ కెన్ నెవర్ బి చేంజ్ త్రూ అవుట్ ద ప్రోగ్రామ్, రైట్. సో కాన్స్టెంట్స్ కెన్ బి సీన్ యాజ్ వేరియబుల్స్. దే ఆర్ ఆల్సో లైక్ లుకింగ్ లైక్, దట్ ఈస్ ఆల్సో లుకింగ్ లైక్ ఏ వేరియబుల్, అంతే కదా, ఇది కూడా వేరియబుల్ లాగే కనిపిస్తుంది. ఏ ఈజ్ ఈక్వల్ టు 5 అని పెట్టాం చూసేటప్పుడు, కానీ విచ్ హోల్డ్ ద సేమ్ వాల్యూ అక్రాస్ ద హోల్ కోడ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూషన్, రైట్. సో మొత్తం ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అయ్యి ఆ ప్రోగ్రామ్ అంతా క్లోజ్ అయ్యేంత వరకు నువ్వు దాంట్లో ఏ వాల్యూ ఇస్తే ఆ వాల్యూ ఉంటుంది. తర్వాత మళ్ళీ నేను దీన్ని ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ చేస్తున్నాను అనుకోండి, అప్పుడు నేను కావాలనుకుంటే 6 or 7 ఇచ్చుకోవచ్చు, కానీ మళ్ళీ ఆ 6ని మళ్ళీ నేను మార్చలేను అనమాట ప్రోగ్రామ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అయ్యేంత వరకు. ఓకే, ఈజ్ దట్ క్లియర్ గైస్? ఈజ్ దట్ క్లియర్? ఓకే, రైట్. సో నౌ let's go back to our right org and see, not org, yeah, developer edition, Salesforce development, right? So let me launch this org, right? So I have created a brand new org, right? So now let's quickly jump into this. Okay, so right, so we all know, right, so Apex is a programming language, and so we have to write the code and all of that in order to create some automations and all of it. But where do you write that code, right? So where you'll go and write that code, right? So if you want to write that code, right, you have to go to developer console. Okay, so not just developer console, guys, right? So you can write so Apex code through different IDs means interactive development environments, right? So interactive development environments means, right, the tools with which you will write code. Okay, so this so developer console, right, so is also a IDE, but that is provided by Salesforce within Salesforce, right? So you can use outside IDs as well, right? So external IDs as well, like VS Code and all of that, right? So there also you can write your code, and then once that code is written, right, you can push that code to your Salesforce org, right? So but if you are writing the code directly within your developer console, right, so within your developer console, right, so then you don't need to push that code so to and fro. Okay, so but right, so most of the times, right, so we prefer VS Code. Why? Because the capabilities and the functionalities that VS Code is offering are very much far better than what Salesforce Developer Console is offering. But most of the times, right, if you want to write some small programs, or if you want to, even while learning also, right, so Developer Console will help us a lot. Okay, so that's what we have. That's where we are currently in, right? So where we are in developer console. Okay, so how to access developer console, right? So you have to go to, tell me where we have to go to. We have to go to this gear icon, right, and click on developer console. That is what you have to do. Sometimes, right, so this pop-up will not come this much big, right? So it will just simply so come somewhere here on the top, right, towards top left corner with a small window and all of that. So you have to check that, right? So if that is the case, you have to maximize it so that it will become like this. Okay, so it will get enlarged so to this extent or to this size. Okay, so what I've done, right, so I have just simply what one sec, yeah, so I've just simply enlarged it. Okay, so now right, so where to write the code, right? So if you want to write the code, or if you want to execute something, right? So in Apex, right? So in Salesforce platform, right? Or within your Salesforce org, right? So you have to go to, right? So something called anonymous window. Okay, so if you want to go to that anonymous window, where you have to go, right? So in the menu, right, you have to go to debug, and from debug, click on open execute anonymous window, right? So whatever you write here, right, and click on execute, so that particular instructions will be executed one after the other, right? So that thing, so those kind of things that we can write within this anonymous window. But most of the times we don't write our regular code within the anonymous window. So most of the times we'll write them as separate classes and everything, and then we'll call those classes whenever needed, right? Through, right, automation and all of that. Okay, but while learning, right, so it is advisable to start using this particular anonymous window. Why? Because so the very next moment you write something, right, you can just simply execute it and see the output of it, right? How that particular code is executing, right? And sometimes, right, so we'll use developer, even even when you're working for any company, right? So even in our right, work environment also, sometimes we use developer console, right, to execute any kind of transactions. Then and there itself, we use this anonymous window. Okay, but now we'll be using the same anonymous window to write our so programs, Apex programs, while learning the Salesforce right, so Apex fundamentals, right? So now let me just simply write a system.debug. Okay, so what is the system.debug? Okay, so now let me print something like hello world. Okay, excuse me guys. What is the system.debug, right? So this is one of the instructions, right? So that we have in Salesforce, right? So one of the statements that we have in Apex, right? So using this particular statement, what you can do is you can print anything. Okay, so you can display something. Okay, you can print anything and you can display something, right? So if I am right, so since I am passing hello world, right, to the system.debug, what the system.debug will do is, right, so the system.debug will give me the output as hello world. Okay, it will just display whatever we are giving as an input to it, right? So that's what so the system.debug will do. Okay, so so in each and every program we have so different set of statements, right? So we use different keywords, right, to print that, right? So if you are using Java or something like that, so I believe you'll use printf. Okay, so if you're using C or something like that, I believe you'll use print, right? So I'm not really sure, right? The same way, right? So for our Apex, we have something called system.debug. If you're giving something here, right, so what it will do is it will print that thing as an output. That's it. Okay, right. So now what I've done, right, I've just simply give system.debug hello world, right? So if I click on execute, then what will happen is that, right, so it will get executed in the backend, right? So once it is executed, so what it will do is it will give us the output, right? So through the logs. Okay, so now let me click on execute. Once I click on this execute, right, if I go to the logs here, right, I'll be able to see that execution over there, right? So let me click on execute. I've clicked on it, right? So that is executed and there is a log that got generated. Okay, so let me open this log. So we call this as debug log. Okay, so in this debug log, right, so you'll have, or the execution log, whatever you want to call it, you can call it, right? So you'll have all the information related to that execution, related to that transaction, right? So once you click on that, once we clicked on that execute, right, so what all things happened, right, at the server end, what all things that CPU has done, what all things that the system has processed, right? So all of that you can see line after line. Okay, so right, so who has executed this? So Ishwar has executed this particular user has executed this. Okay, so the same way there are many other things as well. So what all these things, we'll see that at the later stages, but for now you can just simply leave everything, right? So if you come down, there is something called user debug, right? So if you look at this thing, right, So this is where you'll find whatever input that we have given, right? So either you can click on this directly to see the debug, or right, so you can directly click on debug only, right? So you can just simply so check this tick box, right? Check box, right? Tick this check box, then you'll see only the debug statement, which is debug hello world. What we have given, right? So we have just simply given a string, right? So a string of a data, right? A string data, right? Which is hello world, right? So that hello world we have, we are able to see here. Okay, but if you clearly observe, right, there is something that we have seen here, which is 1. Okay, so that means, right, you can have the debug statement any number of times within your execution, right? So why? Because we want to show whatever we want to show, right? So through that system.debug, whenever we want to show throughout that execution, right? So you can use it 5 times, 6 times, or 7 times, or whatever it would be, right? So here you can see the line number, right? So of the code at which this debug has been executed, or that debug has been so printed out. Okay, so this is the line number of the so that code or the instructions that you have given. Okay, so now in our code, so let me open our anonymous window once again, right? So we have written it at line 1, right? So this was from line 1, right? So that line 1 is this thing. Okay, so and now whatever you want to write, you can write here, and whatever you want to print out, you can print all of those things from this developer console and from this anonymous window. So now let's do one thing, right? So let's do it, right? So earlier what we have done, right? So we have created something called, right? So a is equals to 5, right? And then we have taken two numbers, right? So integer b is equals to 3, right? So, and then c is equals to a plus b, right? So what is this c? C is also an integer. Okay, so integer c is equals to a plus b, and then now let me print this, right? System dot debug, right? So if I just simply give c, then what will happen? So it will print the c, 5 plus 3, and then so it will so give that output in the c, right? So now what I'll do is I'll just simply so remove this. Either we can remove it, or right, so if you don't want any line of code to be executed, then what can we do is we can comment those lines, right? So how can we comment those lines? If we want to comment only one single line, then you will use 2 backslashes, right? So if you're using 2 backslashes, then that line will be commented, and so that line won't be executed at the time of execution of the program, right? So this we call it as single line comments, right? So if you are having multiple lines, and if you want to comment multiple lines, then what you have to do is, right, you have to use backslash star, right? So and then star backslash. Okay, so if you are using this, right, so then what will happen is that, so whatever stuff that you write between right, so this forward slash star and star so backward slash, right? So that thing will be considered as commented, and that those instructions won't be executed in your code. Okay, so now let me just simply comment the first line and leave everything as it is. Okay, so right, so now what's next, right? So now let's execute this and see what will happen, right? So it will print C, and it will show us that output. Right, so now, yeah, so here you can see this as well, right? So whether this particular log is opened or not, right? So if you click on this, it will open that log, and it will show us all the things, right? So now let me go to debug only and see what is there we have, right? So what is there we have in it, right? So 8, so 8 is something we have just seen, right? So 5 plus 3, it calculated, and it gave us that 8 as output, right? So now, right, so what is a variable? As I just told you, right? So as we as we have seen earlier, so what is a variable, right? So variable, let me just open that. Okay, so what is a variable? A variable is a location capable of storing temporary data within the program. This data can then be modified, stored, or displayed whenever needed, right? So now what we can do, right? So here in A, we have stored 5. In B, we have stored 3, right? So, and then what we have done, right? So we have executed something, and we are displaying that particular data here, right? So C is also variable. We are processing something and we are displaying it. So that means, right, so this variable is storing something, right? So, and we are displaying whenever we want to display that. Okay. And if you want to modify also, we can modify it. Okay. So now say, for example, if I'm, changing the value of C to 25 or something like that, and then, right, so if I want to print that once again, then what will happen, right? So then the value in C also will be changed at this line, right? So whenever this line is executed, the value of line also, the value of C also will be, so modified to 25. Let me execute this and see what will happen. Right, so let me go to debug only. Right, first I'll get 8, and after that, right, so I've changed that value, right? I've modified that value to 25. So that way, right, so the data in the variable can be changed. I mean, so we can store values into variables, right? So we can modify them whenever we want to modify them, and we can display them as well, right? So we are displaying it also, right? So that is what variable is all about, right? So, and what's next, right? So, and then, right, so constant is also somewhat similar to variable, right? So that is what we have discussed, right? So, but let's see what will happen, right? So if I am declaring this particular variable as a constant, right? So then what will happen, right? So whatever value that you are setting for the first time into that variable, so that value will remain same throughout your execution. You can never change that value, right? So now let me do that, right? So in order to declare something as a constant, what we have to do, I just told you that we have to make it as final. Okay, so now I have added final, and then now let me try to execute this, right? So since this has become the constant, right, so printing C will never cause any problem for us. But here what I'm doing, right, I am trying to change that value in C to 25, right? So at the time of declaring the variable, what is the value that I've added here, right? I have added 5 plus 3, which is 8. So that means throughout the program, the value that will be there within that C is 8, and it will never change. But here we are trying to change. But now let's see what will happen. It will throw an exception saying that, right, final variable has already been initialized. You cannot do anything. That is what it is saying, right? In that case, what should I do, right? I should never change the value in it, right? So now let me try executing this and see what will happen, right? So now it is success, right? So now it got executed. So now let me go back to this debug only and see. Now the value in it is 8. So is it clear, guys? Variable and constant so far. Is it clear, boys? Is it clear? Is it clear?
Yeah, yes.
Yes, sir.
మళ్ళీ మాట్లాడట్లేదు ఆవిడ.
Yes,
Okay.
Anna.
ఓకే, రైట్, గుడ్. సో నౌ, రైట్, సో ఇప్పుడు ఇక్కడ ఏంటి అసలు ఇంటిజర్ అంటే ఏంటి, అసలు ఇవన్నీ ఏంటి, అసలు ఇక్కడ ఏం జరుగుతుంది, సిస్టమ్ డాట్ డీబగ్ అంటే ఏంటో చెప్పాను, వేరియబుల్ అంటే ఏంటో మనం చూసాము, బాగానే ఉంది. బట్ అసలు ఇంటిజర్ అంటే ఏంటి, అసలు ఏం జరుగుతుంది ఇదంతా, రైట్? సో ఈ మధ్యలో ఇక్కడ సెమీ కాలన్స్ ఎందుకు ఉన్నాయి, ఈ చివరి ఇవన్నీ, రైట్? యూ డోంట్ నీడ్ టు వరీ అబౌట్ ఆల్ ఆఫ్ దిస్. ఐ విల్ టెల్ యూ ఈచ్ అండ్ ఎవ్రీథింగ్ ఇన్ మోర్ డీటెయిల్, రైట్? సో వెళ్ళే కొద్దీ మీకు అర్థమవుతూ ఉంటుంది, నేను చెప్తూ కూడా మీకు ఉంటాను. ఓకే, సో నౌ లెట్స్ సో లుక్ ఎట్ ద వేరియబుల్ డిక్లరేషన్. ఓకే, సో వేరియబుల్ అంటే ఏంటో మనకు అర్థమైపోయింది. అసలు వేరియబుల్ని ఎట్లా డిక్లేర్ చేయాలి, ఆల్రెడీ డిక్లేర్ కూడా చేస్తాం మనం, రైట్? సో బట్ స్టిల్ లెట్స్ లుక్ ఇన్ టు దిస్, రైట్? సో నౌ లెట్స్ లుక్, let's see how we can declare a variable, right? So before we use a variable in Apex, right, so we need to declare the variable. Asalu మనం so if you want to use, right, so a variable within your program, right, if you want to use a variable within your program, first what you have to do is, right, you have to declare that variable, right? So what does that variable declaration means, right? So now let's quickly see that. So without declaring a variable, you cannot use that variable in your program. Why? Because, right, so at the time of declaration, right, if you are declaring a variable, then what will happen is that, right, so the program will get to know while executing, the CPU will get to know, right? So the computer will get to know that I need to allocate a memory space for this particular input, right? So that means people so we'll be receiving input through these values, and we can do whatever we want to do with those values only once we are able to allocate a memory, right? So that's how computer thinks, and what it will do is, right, so it will allocate a memory only if the variable is declared, right? If something is declared as a variable, based on those declarations only, it will allocate the memory, right? So while executing that particular program, right? So for that, what we have to do is we have to declare the variable first, while if you want a program to run, right? So now then what should we do? What should we, I'm like, how to declare that variable, right? So this is the syntax for declaration. What is that, right? So we have to give the data type of it, and then space, and then name of the variable, and then value that you want to store into that particular variable, right? So this is the syntax. What is it, right? So data type, data type, right? So, and then variable name, and then, right? So value. Okay. Right. So now let's quickly see this, right? So that is what we have done, right? So integer a equals to 5. This is what we have done, right? So that means what? This a is the name of the variable, right? So this integer is a data type, and this 5 is the value. Okay. So that is what it is. That is what it is, right? So declaring a variable means defining its type and optionally setting an initial value, right? So ఈ వాల్యూ 5 అని మనం ఏదైతే సెట్ చేస్తున్నాం ఇది ఆప్షనల్ అనమాట. ఇది నువ్వు సెట్ చేయాల్సిన మ్యాండేటరీ ఏం లేదు, రైట్? సో అందుకోసమనే రైట్ ఇక్కడ స్క్వేర్ బ్రేసెస్ లో ఏదైతే ఉందో దీన్ని నువ్వు కన్సిడర్ చేసుకోవచ్చు. స్క్వేర్ బ్రేసెస్ లో ఉన్నాయి అని అంటే ఏమన్నా అవి మ్యాండేటరీ కాదు, ఆప్షనల్ అనమాట. ఇఫ్ యూ వాంట్ టు సెట్ సంథింగ్ యూ కెన్ సెట్ సంథింగ్, అదర్వైజ్ యూ కెన్ జస్ట్ సింప్లీ లీవ్ ఇట్, రైట్? సో ఇంటీజర్ ఏ అని కూడా నువ్వు ఒక వేరియబుల్ ని డిక్లేర్ చేయొచ్చు, రైట్? సో అక్కడ ఏంటి, ఏ అనే మెమరీ లొకేషన్, అంటే ఏ అనే ఒక వేరియబుల్ కోసం ఆ ప్రోగ్రామ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ చేసే ప్రాసెస్లో మెమరీ లొకేషన్ అనేది క్రియేట్ చేసి పెట్టుకుంటుంది ర్యామ్. ఓకే. సో ఎందుకంటే ఇక్కడ ఒక వేరియబుల్ నువ్వు క్రియేట్ చేసావు కాబట్టి, కానీ దీనికి వాల్యూ నువ్వు ఇనిషియేట్ చేయాల్సిన అవసరం లేదు, రైట్? సో కావాలనుకుంటే ప్రోగ్రామ్లో ఎక్కడో నువ్వు అవసరం అనుకున్నప్పుడు దాంట్లోకి ఏదైనా వాల్యూ నువ్వు సెట్ చేసుకోవచ్చు, రైట్? సో వైల్ ఎగ్జిక్యూటింగ్ ఇట్ ఫ్రమ్ సో అదర్ వేరియబుల్స్, రైట్? సో వేరే వేరియబుల్స్ నుంచి ఏమైనా మార్పులు చేర్పులు చేసుకొని కావాలనుకుంటే అందులో నువ్వు వాల్యూ కావాలనుకుంటే పెట్టుకోవచ్చు, కానీ రైట్? సో లేదు, దట్ ఈస్ నాట్ మ్యాండేటరీ అనమాట. ఇనిషియల్గా వాల్యూ అయితే సెట్ చేయాల్సిన అవసరం లేదు. బట్ ఇఫ్ యూ నో వాట్ వాల్యూ దట్ ఈస్ గోయింగ్ ఇన్ టు దట్ వేరియబుల్ at the time of initiation of that particular program, right? So అప్పుడు కూడా మనం వాల్యూ ఇచ్చుకోవచ్చు అనమాట. ఓకే. సో దట్ వే యుల్ డిక్లేర్ ఎ వేరియబుల్, రైట్? either you'll declare it as a, రైట్? సో ఇంటిజర్ a is equal to 5, రైట్? సో ఏం చేస్తాం మనం తర్వాత, ఇంటిజర్ b is equals to 3, తర్వాత ఇంటిజర్ c చేయొచ్చు మనం. ఓకే. ఇంటిజర్ c చేసావు, తర్వాత ఏం చేయొచ్చు, c is equals to a plus b చేయొచ్చు. ఇక్కడ ఏం చేసాం, ఇక్కడ వేరియబుల్, ఇది కూడా వేరియబుల్ డిక్లరేషనే, కానీ తర్వాత ఏం చేసాం, తర్వాత సిలోకి a ప్లస్ బిని మనం సెట్ చేసాం అనమాట, రైట్? సో ఎందుకంటే మనం వేరియబుల్లో డేటా ఎప్పుడైనా మార్చుకోవచ్చు కాబట్టి ప్రోగ్రామ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అవుతున్న ప్రాసెస్లో, రైట్? సో దాన్ని జస్ట్ డిక్లేర్ చేసి దానికి వాల్యూ సెట్ చేయకపోయినా సరే పర్లేదు, రావాలనుకుంటే ఆ ప్రోగ్రామ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ అవుతున్న ప్రాసెస్లో ఎప్పుడన్నా ఎక్కడన్నా దాన్ని కావాలనుకుంటే దాంట్లో వాల్యూ పెట్టుకోవచ్చు, తీసేసుకోవాలనుకుంటే తీసేసుకోవచ్చు. ఓకే. సో దాట్స్ వాట్ the variable declaration is all about, right? So if you clearly observe, that is what we have done, right? So మీరు ఇక్కడ అబ్జర్వ్ చేస్తే ఏం చేస్తాం, ఇంటిజర్ a is equals to 5, రైట్? సో ఇక్కడ a అనేది వేరియబుల్ నేమ్ అయితే ఇంటిజర్ అనేది డేటా టైప్, రైట్? సో తర్వాత ఈ డేటా టైప్ అంటే ఏంటో కూడా మనం చూద్దాం, రైట్? సో తర్వాత 5 అనేది వాల్యూ సెట్ చేసాం, బట్ దిస్ ఇస్ ఆప్షనల్. ఓకే. సో తర్వాత రైట్, సో ఇంటిజర్ c is equals to a plus b అని చెప్పి మనం రాయటం జరిగింది. తర్వాత ఆ cని డైరెక్ట్గా మనం ప్రింట్ చేసాం. system.debug ఏం చేస్తుంది అని చెప్పాను, వాట్ ఎవర్ వీ గివ్ హియర్, గివ్ ఇట్ టు దట్, రైట్? ఇట్ విల్ జస్ట్ సింప్లీ ప్రింట్ దట్ అవుట్. ఓకే. సో దాట్స్ వాట్ దిస్ పర్టికులర్ థింగ్ ఈజ్ ఆల్ అబౌట్. బట్ ఇఫ్ యూ క్లియర్లీ అబ్జర్వ్, రైట్? సో ప్రతి లైన్కి సెమీకాలన్ కూడా మనం పెట్టాం. ఓకే. అసలు ఈ సెమీకాలన్స్ ఎందుకు పెడుతున్నాం ప్రతి లైన్కి అనేది కూడా మనం చూద్దాం, రైట్? సో బట్ బిఫోర్ దాట్, రైట్, సో లెట్స్ గో బ్యాక్ టు వాట్ ఆర్ ద బెస్ట్ ప్రాక్టీసెస్ దట్ వీ హ్యావ్ టు ఫాలో వైల్ డిక్లేరింగ్ ఏ వేరియబుల్. అసలు ఒక వేరియబుల్ డిక్లేర్ చేసేటప్పుడు ఏమేమి బెస్ట్ ప్రాక్టీసెస్ ఫాలో అవ్వాలన్నది ఇక్కడ మనం చూద్దాం, రైట్? సో ఫాలో ఏ క్యామిల్ కేస్ నేమింగ్ కన్వెన్షన్. క్యామిల్ కేస్ అంటే ఏంటి, రైట్? డూ యూ గైస్ నో వాట్ ఈస్ అ క్యామిల్ కేస్? వాట్ ఈస్ అ క్యామిల్ కేస్? హౌ ఏ క్యామిల్ విల్ లుక్ లైక్? క్యామిల్ ఎలా కనిపిస్తుంది? క్యామిల్ ఎలా ఉంటుంది? ఇలా ఉండి ఇలా ఉంటుందా? అవునా కాదా? ఇస్ దట్ రైట్ ఆర్ రాంగ్? క్యామిల్ ఎలాగైనా ఉంటుంది. బొమ్మ గీయటం రాలేదు, రైట్? సంథింగ్ ఇలానే కదా ఉంటుంది, రైట్? సో క్యామిల్ హంప్ అంటే ఏంటంటే ముందు స్మాల్ ఉంటుంది, తర్వాత బిగ్ ఉంటుంది. అంటే సో వాట్ దిస్ క్యామిల్ కేస్ నేమింగ్ కన్వెన్షన్ ఈజ్ ఆల్ అబౌట్ మీన్స్, రైట్? సో జస్ట్ లుక్ ఎట్ దిస్, రైట్? ఇఫ్ యు ఆర్ so mixing two words, right? If you are mixing two words to form a single word, so then what you have to do is, right, so you have to make the first word, right, start with small letter, right, and the second word from second word onwards, right? So whatever words, right, whichever number of words that you are adding to that, so name of that variable, right? So you can make them as capital letters, right? So if you look at this, right, so what we have done here, right, we have made it as camel case, right? So ఇక్కడ camel case లో C ఉంది, small, పెద్దదేమో case ఉంది, right? అంటే ఇప్పుడు మన ఇక్కడ, right, so the name that we have given to our variable is just A. But if you are giving some other names to your variables, right, so student name or something like that we want to capture, right? So student name is the variable, right? So in this case, right, so if you want to store the student name, right, so how you will write that variable name? Student name, this is what you'll write, right? So the student should start with small s and the name, right, so should start with capital N, right? So the name N in the name should start with capital N, and the whole thing will be considered as a variable, right? So and while declaring variables, right, so while declaring variables, right, so the variable should be concise and descriptive. Concise and descriptive means, right, so right, if you look at this, right, if I just simply write it as st name, okay, so can anyone understand this, right? If someone is reading my program at later stages, I have written the program, right? So to store student name, right, so what I've done is I've just simply created a variable with the name st name, right? So since I am the one who created that program, I know, right, so what st name is. St name means student name. But how about others? Will the others be able to understand what you have written here? No, right? They will not be able to understand this, right? So for that reason, you should always keep them descriptive, right? And at the same time, they should be concise. They shouldn't be too lengthy, right? But they should be meaningful, right? So in our case, right, so student name would make more sense. And while declaring many variables, right, so if you are having multiple words in it, you should never use any spaces or something between the words with which you are creating that variable name. Okay, so that is something you have to keep in mind, right? So the variable should contain alphabets. Okay, variable name should contain alphabets and numbers, right? So it can contain alphabets and numbers, right? And underscore as well. Underscore, you guys know underscore, right? Underscore, right? So you can use underscore as well. Okay, so within your variable you can use all of this, right? So alphabets, numbers, and underscore. And your variable name should always start with alphabets. You can never create a variable, right, so with the name 1 2 3 something like this, right? So 1 2 3 right, so name or something like this, whatever you want to give, right? So if you want to create a variable name like this, right, you can never create it. Why? Because so the variable names should always start with alphabets, right? So that is something you guys have to keep that in mind, right? And at the same time, right, so you can have alphabets, numbers, and underscores into your variable name, right? So you can have a name like this, right? So name 1 2 3, right? So or name 2 3 4, or maybe earlier, right, we have given it like this, number 1, right? So is one variable, number 2 is another variable, right? So number 1 and number 2 are variables, right? So if you look at this, right, what we have done, right, so we have used numbers also in our variable name, right? So that means you can use numbers also, right? So you can write it like that, or you can write it like this as well, number underscore 1, right? So number underscore 2 as well, right? So this way also you can declare your variables, right? So these are all the naming conventions that you can follow, right? So while while giving a name to a variable, or while declaring a name to a variable. And there is one more thing that you need to keep in mind, that is Salesforce always recommends us to not use underscores, even though you can use underscores, right? So this underscores is, Salesforce always recommends us to not use underscores as much as possible. Try to use all the words, but not the underscores, right? That is what it is saying, right? So if you have underscores, it will be easy to read, but Salesforce, as a Salesforce best practice, right? So try to not use underscores while declaring any variables or whatever it could be. Okay, so that is something you have to keep in mind. So, and what's next, right? So whenever declaring a new variable, assign it an initial value, that is for numbers 0, for strings empty string. Okay, so why we should be doing this? Okay, so here, right, say for example, if I'm creating two variables, integer a and integer b. Okay, so I can initialize some values at later stages, then, you know, so I can initialize means I can set some values at later stages in my program where I can say a is equals to 5, right? So and b is equals to 3 or something like that, right? If I want to set some values, I can set those values somewhere at later stages in my program execution. But as a best practice, what Salesforce suggests is, right? Not Salesforce suggests, right? So you can do it like this, right? So we already know this is an optional, right? You know, if either you can initialize it or you don't. I mean, if you don't want to, you don't need to initialize it. Okay. If you don't know what value that is going to be, you know, so, you know, stored into that variable in your program, right? So while initiating that program, right? So generally what you can do, right? You can just simply leave it like that without initiating any value. But Salesforce recommends to use some value into that, so that, right? So if you are using that variable somewhere within your program, right? So at later stages, and if that value is not initialized, then what will happen is that, right? So your program will fail. Okay. Say for example, I haven't initialized value into A, right? So I haven't added, you know, 5 into A. I've added only 3 into B, right? So now I have created one more variable named integer C is equals to A plus B. Okay. And after that, right? So this is line 1, line 2, line 3, line 4. In line 5, right? So what I'm doing is I'm printing this C, system.debug, right? So C. Now what will happen, guys? Do you think that C will be printed in this case? No. Why? Because there is no value in A, right? We have only 3 in B, but there is no value in A. So now if you are adding A plus B, what will happen, right? So since there is no value in it, right? So it will fail, right? So if there is no value, it will be considered as null. Okay. If there is no value, what is it considered as? It is considered as null. So keep that in mind. If there is no value in any of the variable, right? So then the value that we will be generally having in that variable is called as null. Null means nothing. Okay. So that is what it is. So now what happened, right? Since you have null in this, right? So you cannot add null with a number, right? Since you cannot add null with a number, it will throw an error. So for that reason, right? You know, Salesforce always, I mean, like, so it is all not Salesforce recommends, it is always best practice to initialize the values with at least 0, right? If you don't know what is the value that is going to have, that you are going to have into this A, right? So what you can do is you can initialize that with 0. Okay. So now what happens, right? So if I'm initializing A with 0, and again, if I'm initializing B also with 0, then what will happen, right? The same program, if you run it now, right? So now the output will be 3. Why? Because you have 0 in A, 0 in B, and at line 3, you have changed the value in B to 3. Now the value in B is 3, right? So now you're trying to add C is equals to A plus B, where is 0 plus 3. Now the output will be 3. So now this didn't throw us any error. Okay. So this way, right? If there are any, if you are using that variable unwantedly, unknowingly somewhere without declaring it, right? So there are chances that your code will fail. So for that reason, it is always advisable to have at least 0 added into that at the time of initialization, if it is an integer. Okay. So the same way, if it is a string, like, you know, name of the student, right? Or name or whatever it would be, right? In that case, what can you do, right? Don't just simply create it as an empty one, at least make it empty, right? So if you want to make it empty, you have to just simply, you know, so give, you know, 2 double quotes with nothing in it, then it will considered as empty string. Okay. So only not double quotes, right? Single quotes, right? So 1 single quote, right? 2 single quotes, right? So then, you know, so it will be considered as, you know, empty string, right? So that way, whatever variable, whatever type of variable that you are declaring, right? So that type of variable you should be, I mean, like, so that type of data you should be storing it, that type of empty data, right? Some sort of empty data you'll have, that data you have to store. Okay. So this is something you guys have to keep in mind. Is it clear, guys? Is it clear so far?
Yes,
Is
sir.
it clear so far? Okay. So if I go back to my program, right? So what we have done, right? So, right. So I can just simply declare it like this as well, right? So integer A, integer B, right? And after that, if I want to add some value into it, A is equals to 3, right? So B is equals to 5, something like that, right? And then C is equal to A plus B, right? So this will work fine. Okay. So, but what if, right? So I'm not adding anything to A. And if I'm trying to print this up, now let's see what will happen. Attempt to dereference in null objects, right? There is some exception coming up, right? Which is saying, right? So boss, నువ్వు నల్ అనే దాన్ని వాడటం కోసం ట్రై చేస్తున్నావు ఏ వాల్యూ లేకుండా అందులో అని చెప్తాను. సో ఫర్ దాట్ రీజన్ ఇట్ ఇస్ ఆల్వేస్ గుడ్ టు ఇనిషియలైజ్ వాల్యూస్ విత్ some sort of data. If it is an integer, always try to add 0, right, at the time of declaring a variable. If it is an string, try to add empty quotes, right? So then that is the best practice that you have to follow. Okay, so that's what this particular thing is all about. Okay, so now let's execute this and see what will happen, right? So now you will get output as 5. Why? Because in B you are keeping 5, in A you have 0, in B you have again right, so 0, but here we are reassigning the value to 5, right? So let me execute this and see what will be the output. Right, so now we'll have output as 5. Okay, so that's what this whole thing is so all about, right? So that is what variable declaration and so all these things, right? So then now let's go to the next topic, which is data types. Okay, so we'll discuss data types now, and once we are done with data types, then we can end today's session. So I'll not take more than 10 minutes of your time. Okay, so just please wait till we are done with it. Okay, right? So now what are data types, right? So data types defines what type of data variable is going to store. Okay, so what type of data that the variable is going to store, right? So if you look at the variable declaration, what is the variable declaration? We have data type, right? So and then space, right? And then variable name, right? And then what is it? Equals to value, right? So this is what we have seen, right? So this is the syntax of variable declaration, right? So integer A equals to 5, right? So this is what we have seen, right? Or integer A is equals to 0, whatever you want to call it. You can just, you can have, we want to have it, you can have it, right? Integer A is equals to 0. If you look at this, right? So what is it, right? So this A is a variable which is going to store what type of data? It is going to store integer type of data, right? So this A is going to store which type of data? Integer type of data, right? So the data type defines, right, what type of data variable is going to store, right? So this is what we call it as a data type, right? So whenever you are creating a variable, right, you should always make sure that you are declaring, I mean, like, you are giving the data type of that variable as well, right? While declaring a variable, whatever type of data that variable is going to store, right? So that data type also you have to give, right? So we have lot of data types, right? So integer is one of the data types, right? So integer is a data type, right, which stores number, right? So it stores number values. Okay, so the same way, right, we have something called string. String is a data type which stores string values, right? So string student name or something like that, if I keep, right? So then what will happen, right? So the student name variable is going to store string type of data, right? So that is what we are trying to so explain here. I'm like, so not explain, right? That is what we are trying to store here. Okay, so that's what this data type is all about, right? So how many types of data types that we have in Salesforce, right? So now let's look at that, right? So we have majorly 5 types of data types. Okay, so out of those 5, right, so major data types are primitive data types. Okay, so primitive data types are like, the base data types that every programming language will have. Okay, so on top of those data types, right, so different programming languages have created different type of data types based on their programming language requirements. Okay, so these are all are so Salesforce defined data types. Okay, but these primitive data types are primitive ones, that's why they have called as primitive, right? So the regular data types. Okay, regular data types that every programming languages uses. Okay, so that means, right, so whenever you are declaring a variable, as I just told you, we have to declare the data type, right? So That means, right, you can declare a data type, right, declare a variable with all these type of data types. You can declare something with the help of primitive data types, right? So primitive data types, that related data types, right? As objects, you can declare variables, of type as objects. You can declare of variables type, so collections. You can declare variables of type enums. You can declare variables of type classes, objects, and interfaces, right? So don't need to worry about, what these S objects, collections, enums, classes, objects, and interfaces. In our upcoming classes, we'll see all of this in detail. But for now, just simply remember, right? So we have 5 types of data types, right? So one is primitive data types, right? And the other one is S object, collections, enum, classes, objects, and interfaces. Okay, right. So now within this primitive data types, right? So we have 8 different type of data types, right? So that are available in our Salesforce. Now let's look at all of those 8, so different data types one after the other. Okay, so integer. Okay, so what is this integer data type, right? This data type stores number values. Okay, this data type stores number values, right? So now let's do one thing, right? So integer, right? So age is equals to, right? So 23 or something like that. Okay, so and then, right? So right, so this is what, right? So age is a variable, right? So where we are storing what number type of data, right? So whenever you want to store number type of values into your variable, then you use integer data type, right? And then we have something called double, right? So what this double, right? So double generally stores decimal type of data. Okay, so if you look at pi, right? So what is pi? What does generally pi stores, right? So pi stores, right? So here, what does generally pi stores, right? Pi stores decimal sort of data. Pi is equal to what? 3.14, right? So pi is equal to 3.14. Then that means what is this, right? So this is a decimal number, right? So it has 2 decimal places, right? So if you want to store decimal values, then what you'll do, right? So you'll use something called double, right? If you're using something called double, right? So double is a type of data type, right? Which stores decimal numbers. Okay, pi is equals to 3.14 or something like that. Okay, so now let's store so information. Okay, so let's keep it like this. Okay, so and then what's long, right? So if your number is very long, okay, so then, right, so you cannot store that in the integer type of data. Okay, so double stores decimal values, right? So the same way, right, so next goes to long stores long numbers. Long numbers means big numbers. Okay, or big numbers. Okay, bigger ones. That means, say for example, you want to store world's population. How much is the world's population, guys? Tell me. What is the world's population? So it is somewhere around 700 crores, right? Right, 7 billion people, right? So 7 billion people, right? 700 crores means how many zeros you'll have? 700 and again another 7. 1 2 3 4 5 6 7, right? This much big number, right? If you want to store this much big number, you cannot store that into integer type of data, right? So in that case, what you have to do, that you have to declare it as long, right? So world population equals to 7 crore, blah 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 blah, you'll add, right? But you have to do something, which is you have to add L at the end. So then only it will consider that as a long type of data that you are storing. Okay, you have to append L at the end, right? So and then what's next, right? So date. So what does date stores, right? So date stores date values, right? So date values, right? If you want to store date values, we use date type of data type. Say for example, you want to store birth date, right? So someone's birthday, right? In that case, what you can do, date, right? So birthday, right, equals to, you can store his birth date, right? So how does so data so stored into date type, date data type, is that, right? So year, month, and then date. Okay, please keep that in mind. What is this? Year, month, date. Is this clear, guys? Okay, so that is what it is, right? So or else, right? So let's, I'm not really sure. I believe DDMMYY. No, it's reversed, right? So year, month, date, day. Okay, so this how it'll store, right? So if you have born on, right, so 2000, if you have born in 2000, right, so in the month of 8th, right, so on the date of 31st August, right, so then this is how it will store that date, right? So and then you have something called date time. What does this date time store, right? So date time store both date and time. Okay, so you want birth date and along with the time as well. So then what can you do, right? You can use date time variable, date time, right? So birth time or something like that. You want to store birth time. Then what you can do, right? So along with date, year, month, day, right? So along with day, right? So you'll have what? Hours, right? So minutes, what all things we'll have in time? Hours, minutes, and then seconds, right? And then milliseconds, blah, 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 and all of that, right? So that means what? 2000, right? You have born in 2000 in August month, right? On 31st date, right? So and at what time, right? And in morning, what is it? Right? So morning 8 o'clock, say for example, 8:30 p.m. or AM, right? So 8 o'clock, 30 minutes and 0 seconds, 0 seconds, right? So this is how the date values, so date time values are stored. Okay, so in date time, right, you will store date time value, right? So in string, what do you generally store? You'll store string data. String data means, right? So name string, right? So name is equals to, right? So say for example, Sri Lanka, right? So then what you can do, right? So you'll call it as right, so string. So this data is a string data. Okay, Sri Lanka is a string, right? So if you want to store string type of data, right, so then you use string data type, right? The same way, right, in primitive data types we have ID as well. What is this ID in Salesforce, right? For each and every you'll have record IDs, right? So those IDs also it is of type primitive data only. Okay, so then what is it, right? So if you want to store IDs, ID equals to some record ID, whatever record ID is it, right? 001, blah, 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 right? So that record IDs you want to store, you will store that in IDs, right? So, and then the last one is Boolean. Okay, what is this Boolean? So Boolean stores two types of data. Okay, one is, one second. So Boolean stores only one type of data, right? So either only two values, right? Either true or false. Okay, keep this in mind, right? So what does Boolean store? Boolean store either true or false. That's it. Okay, so that means, right, right, so now I want to know whether Sri Lanka is a Salesforce professional or not. That's it. Okay, so then in that case what you can do, right, Boolean is SF professional, right? So avuna kada, she is an SF professional, she is a Salesforce professional. So in that case, what type of value you will be storing into this? True. That's it. Okay, either it will store true or false or yes or no. So those kind of values if you want to store, right, so then we'll use what? Boolean data type. Is it clear, guys? Is it clear? What does integer store? Tell me one after the other. What does integer store?
Numbers.
What is it?
Number
Number,
value.
yes, number. Okay, and then, right, so we'll have decimal also here, guys. Decimal stores small decimals, double stores bigger decimals. Okay, so decimal and double stores decimal numbers. Decimal is a smaller decimal stores smaller decimals, double stores bigger decimals. What does long stores? Long stores longer numbers,
Long number values.
longer numbers. Date stores dates, right? So date time stores date time values. If you want to store date time values, you'll use datetime. If you want to store string type of data, you'll use string. If you want to store ID, you'll use ID. If you want to store either true or false, you'll use Boolean. Okay, so these are the things we majorly use, right? So once we are done with our, so I'm not done with our, right? So so in our upcoming classes, we'll see what S objects, what collections, what enums, right? So what are classes and all of that. In while we are learning OOPS concepts and everything, right? So we'll get to know all of these things. Okay, so at that point in time, so we'll see what kind of data these S objects, collections, enums, and classes, and all of that, are going to store, right? So, but first let's learn primitive data types. These are the things we'll learn later. Okay, so now let's do one thing. Now let's try to create, some kind of. Now let's declare, each type of data type and see how can we store all of that. Okay, so now let's go to our anonymous window. Right, so let me comment all of this, right? So if I want to comment multiple lines, what should I do? I should use this particular thing. Okay, right. So now let me directly jump in and let me enlarge this a little bit, right? So okay, so let's start it from here. Okay, so integer, let's start with integer age, or else let's print all of this. String name equals to student name. Let's write it like this. Okay, now let's look at this. What I've done, I've used camel case, right? Student. So in student, S is small and N is capital. Okay, this is best practice. That's it. Even if you don't follow it, so Apex don't so throw any error or something like that. But that is one of the best practices that we have to follow. Okay, student name, right? So equals to, right? So string values, you have to keep them in single quotes. Okay, in Apex you will keep them in single quotes. In other programming languages, so most of the times we'll be using double quotes and all of that, but in Apex you have to use single quotes, right? So what is the name? Srilekha is the name. Okay, so and after that, string, what more we can add here? String student name, string age, right? So let's add some age, right? I'm giving some random age, right? So if I'm giving 23 like this, right? So then this will also be this also will be considered a string. Whenever you're adding something between two so quotes, then it will automatically becomes as a string, right? So but here we are storing number data, right? So for that reason you should not use so any kind of quotes or something like that. You can just simply leave numbers. Okay, so and after that, what more, right?
Long.
string so not string, right? Let's use, right? No, this shouldn't be string, right? So this should be integer. Okay, and after that, okay, so right, so let's use boolean. Okay, boolean, what does boolean stores, right? It stores true or false, right?
True or false.
So is she serious? Okay, true, very serious. Kabatti true. Okay, so and then what's next? Okay, what's up? Or else is Salesforce professional. Let's keep it like that. Okay, is Salesforce professional. Okay, right. So and after that, what? Right, so boolean we are done with, right? So and then what? And then what? And then what? Long or double, right? So decimal. Tell me, decimal. What can we add here? Is there anything that we can relate to decimal for student? All right. So, right, let's write it like this. Okay. Skill percentage or something like that. Oh, okay. Let's not. Okay, let's write it. 71.35 or something like that. Okay, so this is the decimal, right? If you are adding a decimal, right, you'll just simply use it like this. Okay, so and you want to store some pi or something like that. In that case, what can we do? Right, so double pi equals to 3.1456, right? 235 blah 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 blah. Okay, so if you are having this much big decimal, these many decimal points, then you'll use double. Okay, so and then what more we have? Tell me, guys. So what more data types we have? Come on, please tell me.
Date.
Okay, date and
Date and time.
date time. But before that, we have something called long as well, right? So long world population, it's something like this. Right, so what is the world's population? 7 lakhs, 700 crores, right? So okay, since that is a big number, right, long number, right? So what I've told you, you have to use L at the end. Okay, so and after that, date, right? So while adding date, guys, right, so what you have to do is, right, so we cannot directly add those values like this. Okay, like how we have added so what is it, right? So these numbers, right, strings and all of that, we cannot just simply give the date like this, right? So what I've told you, year, right? So 2000, right? So what is the next one? I said 8th month, right? So 31st or something like that, right? You cannot give it like this, right? So Salesforce doesn't understand this, right? So if it is a string, you'll have it between two single quotes. If it is a number, you'll have it like this, right? So all other things Salesforce can directly identify. If it is a date, you cannot directly give it like this. In that case, what you have to do is you have to use date class. Okay, so what is a class? You don't need to worry about all of that, right? But just simply for now, just simply remember it like this. Okay, date dot new instance. Then here you have to give year, month, and a date. What is the year? 2000. What is the month? 8th month. What is the day? 31st, right? So I'm not really sure whether it is a birthday or not, but I'm just simply giving some random date, so thing. Okay, so date time, right? If we want to store date time, right? In that case, what can you do, right? So birth time, right? How can we store? We can store it in the date time, right? So date dot not date, right? So since this is date time, right? So we have date time class as well, right? From that, again, you have to take new instance. Okay, the new instance, right? So new instance. What is it? Year 2000, all right? So and then 8th month, and then 31st, and then hours, right? So morning 8, right? 30 minutes for 30 minutes, 0 seconds. Okay, so this way we can add, right? So and then what's next? What is the last one that we have seen? ID, right? Is that right? ID, right? So now let's take any of the lead IDs or whatever it could be that are there in our Salesforce org. You can still do that, not just lead ID, any ID you want to store, right? So you can store that into one of the variables, and it is of primitive data type. Just please keep that in mind, right? All the other data types are built on top of these primitive data types, right? So Salesforce has used those primitive data types and it has built some custom data types, right? So Salesforce defined data types, and those data types you can use wherever you want to use, right? So they are different data types, but these are the major base data types. Using these data types, if you want to create some other things on your own data types, you can still do that. Okay, we can see all of those things later in later stages, but let me capture any of the ID here. Okay, so account ID. Okay, ID, account ID, you can give any name over there. Okay, but I'm giving only account ID, name as account ID, right? So I have stored all of this information, right? So this way we have to declare our variables. Okay, now let me print all of these things, right? So system dot debug. If I want to print, what should I do? System dot debug of student name, right? System dot debug of, right? So these, what I'm doing, right? I'm just giving that variables, that's it, whatever variables that are here, right? If I want to pass some default text, then what I can do, I can just simply give, right? So 2 single quotes, and I can pass that string by default, right? Or otherwise, if you want to pass a variable, right, in that case, you have to pass it like this. Okay, directly you have to give the name of the variable. Okay, so let me just simply, okay, so let me add all of them here, right? So age is Salesforce professional. All right, so and then skills percentage, and then pi. Okay, and then world's population, birth date, okay, and then birth time, account ID. Okay, we remove this. So let me execute all of this and let's see what will happen, right? So it'll print all of them, right? So if I click on open log, it'll directly open the log. I don't need to, so after the execution, I don't need to go back, so here and again click on that one to read what is there in it. I can just simply, click on check this checkbox and click on execute. So once it is executed, it will, automatically display all of that. What it is saying, unexpected token account ID. Okay, right. So this one also you have to give it in single quotes. Okay. So let me execute this. ID also you have to give it in single quotes, right? Like a string. Right. So now let's see all of that, right? Sri Lanka 23 true, right? 71.35, 3.14, blah, 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 700, right? So date, all right. So see now how the output has came, right? 2008 of 30, right? So 8th month, 31st date, time and all of that, right? So, and then at last ID, right? So this is what it has printed. Okay. So these are the things that so that you guys have to keep in mind. So if you're strong with, so variable declaration and Apex data types and all of that, so then, so all other things can be learned in an easy way. Okay. So that's what for today's class, right? If you guys have any questions, please let me know. And there are many other things that we'll learn. Okay. So few things that, you may not be aware, right? Why we are using this semicolon at each and every line, right? So that also we'll learn in our upcoming classes, right? But in general, so each and every line you have to end with semicolon, like how, right, when you are writing anything on your book or so on your notepad, right, we use full stops, right? The same way, if if you have to complete one statement in any of the programming languages, you'll use semicolons. Okay. So instead of full stops, we'll use semicolons. Okay. So that's what the semicolon is all about, right? So you are writing instructions here, right? So what you have done, right? So you have declared some variables, and into those variables you have set some values, and after that, right, you are printing all of those variables, right? So you are asking your program to print all of those variables, so as an output, right? So that's what you are doing, right? You are giving some input through variables and you're printing all of them, right? So using system.debug, that's what this program is doing, right? So that's what we are executing here. Okay. So is it clear, guys, so far whatever we have discussed, or is this still confusing, guys?
Clear Anna.
Clear, Anna? Okay. Sai Krishna, how about you?
Clear Anna. Yeah.
Okay. So now I'll ask, few questions, right? So now you guys have to answer them. So I'll ask, questions randomly, right? So what is camel case? Sai Krishna.
అన్న ఏంటి అర్థం కాలేదు క్వశ్చన్.
Camel case అంటే ఏంటి? Camel case ఎక్కడ వాడతాం? వేరియబుల్ డిక్లేర్ చేసేటప్పుడు ఏమన్నా వేరియబుల్ తాలూకు పేరు 2-3 వర్డ్స్ ఉంటే ఫస్ట్ లెటర్ చిన్నదాంతో స్టార్ట్ అవ్వాలి, సెకండ్ వర్డ్ లెటర్స్ అన్ని కూడా క్యాపిటల్ లెటర్లతో స్టార్ట్ అవ్వాలి. ఓకే, రైట్. సో వై వీ హ్యావ్ టు initialize a variable? If it is an integer variable or a string variable, why we have to initialize a variable at the time of declaration, right? So is it mandatory to initialize a variable? And if it is not mandatory, right, so why Salesforce recommends us to initialize a value? Tell me. Sai Krishna. Question అర్థమైందా? Hello. Sai Krishna, please speak out, buddy. Anyone want to answer this question? Padmini?
We don't need to initialize that during the program, but it's a best practice to do it while assigning, while initializing the variable. We can do it while executing also.
Okay, why it is so best practice?
So, ఒకవేళ ఏదైనా వేరియబుల్ అసైన్ చేయకపోతే
దాన్ని ఎక్కడైనా మనం మనకు తెలియకుండా వాడేస్తే ఎర్రర్ త్రో అవుతుంది కాబట్టి. ఓకే, దట్స్ రైట్. సో గుడ్ గుడ్ గుడ్. ఓకే, సో రైట్. వాట్ ఈస్ ఎ డేటా టైప్? సాయి కృష్ణ చెప్పు. సాయి కృష్ణ, వాట్ ఈస్ డేటా టైప్? Sai Krishna, are you there? Srilekha, tell me, what is data type?
It defines what type of data we are going to store.
We are going to store in a variable.
Variable.
Okay, right, good. So what is so what are high level, can you give any so can you name any few high level programming languages? Bunny?
లేదని తెలియదు అన్నంతే.
తెలీదా? ఇప్పుడే కదరా చెప్పుకున్నాం కదరా క్లాస్లో. హై లెవెల్ ప్రోగ్రామింగ్ లాంగ్వేజెస్ ఎన్ని ఉన్నాయి? ఎన్ని కాదు, ఏమన్నా 2-3 చెప్పు. లో లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్ అంటే ఏంటి, హై లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్ అంటే ఏంటి చెప్పు. వాట్ ఈస్ లో లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్, వాట్ ఈస్ హై లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్? Bunny, are you there?
అన్న
What is low level language, what is high level language? Okay, right. Purushottam, what is low level language and what is high level language? Can you give any can you name any 3 high level programming languages?
High level language data. High level language data. అంటే 8 అవే
హై లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్ అంటే డే టు డేటా అంటారా ఏంట్రా? హై లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్ అంటే ఏం చెప్పాను నేను? కంప్యూటర్కి డైరెక్ట్గా అర్థం చేసుకోలేదు, 0 1తో అర్థం చేసుకుంటుందని చెప్పానా? 0 1తో అర్థం చేసుకుంటే దాన్ని ఏ లాంగ్వేజ్ అని అంటామని చెప్పాను? బైనరీ లాంగ్వేజ్ కానీ, మెషిన్ లాంగ్వేజ్ కానీ, లేదా లో లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్ కానీ అని అంటామని చెప్పానా? అది అర్థమైందా లేదా పోనీ ఆ కాన్సెప్ట్?
గుర్తులేదు ఇలాగే చెప్పారు కదా.
ఇప్పుడే కదరా చెప్పుకున్నాం, ఇంకెప్పుడో చెప్పుకోలేదు కదా. ఓకే, సో యా, రాబర్ట్, టెల్ మీ రాబర్ట్,
అన్నా
నేమ్ ఫ్యూ ఆఫ్ ది హై లెవెల్ ప్రోగ్రామింగ్ లాంగ్వేజెస్. హై లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజెస్.
హై లెవెల్ లాంగ్వేజ్ అంటే పైథాన్, ఇంకా పైథాన్, ఊప్స్, అదే జావా అన్న.
ఇంకా
సి, C++,
ఎపెక్స్ అన్ని చెప్తున్నావు, ఎపెక్స్ చెప్పట్లేదు.
ఎపెక్స్,
ఓకే రైట్.
ఎపెక్స్.
Okay, right. Good. So, while processing, right? So while so performing any particular task, or while executing, right? So what CPU will do, right? What CPU will do with the input data, input and output data. Where does CPU store that input data and output data while processing? So a request, or maybe while running a program, while executing a program, where does it store? Whatever data that we
RAM.
define in our variables, right? So program లో మనం పెట్టుకునే variables లో వేరియబుల్స్లో వేరియబుల్స్ మనం అసైన్ చేసే డేటా ప్రోగ్రామ్ ఎగ్జిక్యూట్ చేసేటప్పుడు ఎందులో స్టోర్ చేసుకుంటుంది, CPU ర్యామ్లో స్టోర్ చేసుకుంటుంది. ర్యామ్లో స్టోర్ చేసుకొని ర్యామ్ నుంచి తీసుకొని దాన్ని ప్రాసెస్ చేసి మనకి మళ్ళీ అవసరం అనుకుంటే అవుట్పుట్ ఇస్తుంది. ఓకే, సో డేటా అంతటిని వాడేది హ్యాండిల్ చేసేది ఏంటంటే ర్యామ్, మెయిన్ మెమరీ ఆర్ ఇంటర్నల్ మెమరీ అని కూడా అంటారు. ఓకే, సో దట్ ఈస్ వాట్ ఇట్ ఈస్. ఓకే, సో అండ్ దెన్ వాట్స్ నెక్స్ట్ right? So that's it guys for today. So I can ask any number of questions if needed, but so I believe it is almost more than 2 hours, right? So 2.5 hours. I know it will be little exhausting, but still మీరు క్లాస్లో అటెంటివ్గా లేరు అని అయితే నాకు అనిపించింది. సాయి కృష్ణ, ఐ డోంట్ ఫైండ్ యూ అటెంటివ్. ఇలా ఉండకూడదు రేపటి నుంచి. సాయి కృష్ణ నీకే చెప్తున్నా.
అన్నయ్య లేదన్న, యాక్చువల్ గా మీరు మొబైల్ ల్యాప్టాప్ ఛార్జింగ్ మొబైల్ తో లాగిన్ అయ్యాను. ఆ టైంలో కాల్ వచ్చింది, నేను వినలేదు క్వశ్చన్స్ ఏవి వినలేదు నిజంగా. అంటే ఇప్పుడు చూసిన తర్వాత మీరు పిలుస్తా ఉన్నారు, నేను కాల్ రావడం వల్ల కట్ చేయాల్సి వచ్చింది.
Okay, right. So please make sure that you guys are listening. Okay, that's fine, Sai. So క్లాస్లో అయితే మాత్రం పూర్తిగా వినండి. సో బన్నీ, పురుషోత్తం, సో ప్లీజ్ మేక్ షూర్ దట్ యు ఆర్ లిజనింగ్ టు థింగ్స్ అటెంటివ్లీ. మీకు ఎక్కడన్నా కష్టమైతే చెప్పండి, నేను తెలుగులోనే చెప్తాను. ఓకే, సో ఇవాళ కూడా మధ్య మధ్యలో అక్కడక్కడ తెలుగు నేను వాడాను. సో ఐ విల్ సీ ఇఫ్ ఐ కెన్ సో టీచ్ ఎవ్రీథింగ్ ఇన్ తెలుగు ఇఫ్ యూ గైజ్ ఆర్ రియలీ ఫీలింగ్ డిఫికల్ట్ టు అండర్స్టాండ్. ఓకే, right, Sarina?
Okay.
So
Okay.
if you guys don't have any questions, I'll end this session. But once again, so if anyone is not coming, right, if anyone is not joining the class, please intimate me in advance. Okay, so otherwise I'll be expecting you to join. So until or unless that person is joined, right, so I won't be starting the class from tomorrow. Okay, so please make sure that you're doing. And ఇవాళ చెప్పింది ఏదైతే ఉందో ఇదంతా నోట్స్ రాసుకొని అండ్ ఇవాళ ఇచ్చే హ్యాండ్స్ ఆన్ ఎక్సర్సైజెస్ ఏమైనా ఉంటే అవన్నీ కూడా రేపటి కంప్లీట్ చేసుకోండి. ఓకే, సో లెట్స్ క్యాచ్ అప్ టుమారో. హ్యావ్ ఎ లవ్లీ డే. బాయ్ బాయ్.
బాయ్ అన్న.
బాయ్ బాయ్.
బాయ్ అన్న.
Bye.